Working. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ramsha Jahangir, a Senior Policy and Communications Associate at the Global Network Initiative. And on behalf of GNI, I welcome you all to our annual Learning Forum 2023. Thank you so much for taking the time out. And it's really, really great to see so many of different stakeholders we work with, partners, especially in Europe, here in person and those attending online. So we really appreciate your presence today. Just quickly, I'm going to run over some ground rules for today. So the event is being live streamed. We have people attending from all over the world. So those attending online specifically, if you have any questions for the panelists, please leave them in chat. We will be monitoring the chat and we will be sure to get your questions to the moderators. If you can't hear us or if there are any technical difficulties, our team is monitoring the chat as well. So please feel free to let us know if there are any issues as well. We will also be taking pictures because it is a public event. So if any of you don't consent to your pictures being taken, please let us know. We have our staff, you can let me know as well. And hopefully there won't be an issue. So to officially start the event, I would like to invite the independent chair of GNI, David Kay, who's also as you all would know, he's a famous person, the former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and the protection of the right to opinion. So very pleased to have you, David, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramsha. Great. Thanks to everybody for being here. It's great to see everybody who migrated from our board meeting, which I'll say a word about, and others who've joined us. This is, I think, for those of you who might be new to GNI, the annual Learning Forum is a really important part of the work that GNI does. And it's important for several reasons. I think the most important reason is that it allows us this space to actually take a lot of what we've been discussing and learning in the context of policy committees and assessment and learning committees and bring them together in one particular forum. And there is just such rich diversity in GNI and such rich diversity in this room that we really get just a lot out of bringing people together to have a very focused conversation about hard areas of policy. And I think, as you'll see over the course of the day, the issues that we want to talk about are not really the easy issues. And GNI, I mean, at the end of the day, is really not about the easy issues, right? It's about those particular moments where governments, I mean, at least in terms of the kind of quintessential way we think about GNI, those quintessential moments where governments place demands on companies that are members of the GNI, that isn't really just about putting pressure on the companies, but is about putting pressure ultimately on users, on individuals, their freedom of expression, their privacy, and what are the standards that we expect companies to abide by when they get those kinds of requests or demands. That's very much what GNI is about. And you can, I'm sure, like, as I say that, you could have a million ideas of of those examples in your head as to what I might be referring to. And those are never easy. I mean, in the public discussion, it might seem like, oh, these are easy things to solve, just do the right thing. But I think those of us in this room know that's never really how the world works. So I'm very happy to kind of launch us off here into our day of discussion. And what I want to do is, in part, to introduce people to what assessment is in GNI. I want to turn it over to Idan, who is going to walk us through. Idan is one of our great staff members in the GNI and has really focused and done a tremendous amount of work in particular, I would say, over the course of, I mean, it's something that we all went through, the pandemic, and sort of keeping us together, but then also shepherding us into a new world where we're a growing organization with growing membership, both on the company and the non-company side. And Idan has just done a tremendous job in leading us through this. So Idan is going to kind of walk us through, I think, if that's a right way to put it, what assessment actually looks like. And then following Idan, we have, as you see, I think if you've seen in the schedule, we have an afternoon of conversations that I think are going to be very timely in terms of the kind of regulatory moment that we're in. And then we'll obviously open that up to broader conversation so that this isn't just sort of presenting, but it's also hearing back and having conversations about these issues. So maybe I can turn it over to Idan Ben-Yakir and welcome you to the stage.
Thank you very much, David. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Idan Ben-Yakir. I'm Senior Operations and Policy Associate at GNI. And to start off the annual learning forum this year, what we're going to do is walk through a little exercise, and it does contextualize the assessment a little bit. It's more of a demonstration of how the GNI framework works in practice. And any good classroom teacher will tell you that you have to start with a nice, energizing exercise to get the attention of your students. You may find on your chairs these sheets of paper with background information for a country called Genovia, where you will be playing the role of a senior manager at Teleworld, which is a GNI member company. I will read out the factual background and your role for a bit, and then we have legal background next. It is on the slides here, but I think you will want the sheets for context. So the Republic of Genovia will hold presidential elections next year, 2024. The incumbent President Thermopoulos is campaigning for a third term, and her party holds a majority in the legislature. Senator Rinaldi, the other leading candidate, is a long-standing representative of a minority ethnic group. Senator Rinaldi has been gaining popularity in recent years as a vocal critic of the administration's increasingly authoritarian actions. An unidentified person tried to crash a van into a crowded square abutting the presidential residence in 2020, killing only the driver. Public demonstrations in the capital have since become more frequent and occasionally escalated to violence. Despite inconclusive independent reports, President Thermopoulos maintains that the attacker was affiliated with Rinaldi, and the government has taken action against some Rinaldi supporters and journalists in the time since, citing threats to public order. You will be an executive at GNI member company Teleworld, which is a multinational company. It's based in a rights protective jurisdiction with a strong rule of law. And Teleworld has sole ownership of Telegen, Genovia-based telecoms operator, and it's the country's leading mobile network operator. The other local internet operators are the domestically owned Novacom, who has 32% of the market share, and the foreign-owned Cupid, which is also based in a rights protective jurisdiction. Most people in Genovia don't have a fixed internet connection, and they rely solely on their mobile devices for connectivity. Now, the legal background in Genovia. The Constitution of the Republic of Genovia guarantees citizens the right to free expression and protects privacy of citizens in their homes, correspondence, telephone conversations, and telegraphic communications. However, Section 40 permits laws that abrogate these protections if they're reasonably justifiable in a democratic society in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. The Communications Regulatory Authority oversees the regulation of the telecom sector and administers the Communications Regulatory Code. It has the authority to issue operating licenses to telcos. Such licenses are contingent on the installation of any equipment required by the government for monitoring purposes, and further state that the government may take over the license's service in the public interest in the event of a national emergency. Local employees may be held liable for noncompliance with government orders and directions in some circumstances. Order network, the authority also has the authority to order network operators to keep records of traffic data, subscriber information, and related content for a period prescribed by the authority, which is 2 years, to block the usage of mobile terminals in any sensitive area on national security grounds. The licensee must deny service within 6 hours of a legally sufficient request. and it has the authority to revoke licenses for the use of network for anti-national activities, which also is a criminal offense. No legal document prescribes the method and the instrument that the government may use in this regard. Additionally, the CRC also permits a court or officer in charge of a police station to issue an order for the production of any document or other thing necessary or desirable for the purpose of any investigation, inquiry, trial, or proceeding. Now everyone take a deep breath. So, we are going to jump right into a first demand. You are the Teleworld company executive, and you've received a demand because a recent public demonstration resulted in the hospitalization of a Thermopolis supporter and the arrest of a Rinaldi supporter. Rinaldi supporters returned after the police cleared the scene and began marching nonviolently, blocking streets as they moved towards the presidential residence. The deputy director of the Office of Public Safety called the local Telegen office via the general number and demanded that the company send out an SMS message to all the users in the city, notifying them of an immediate curfew for reasons of public safety and ordering them to return to their homes. The employee that received this call escalated the matter to the Telegen CEO, who escalated the matter to you over in your rights protecting jurisdiction. So just by a show of hands, who would comply with this request? I'm shocked. Who would not comply? Who wants to give a reason why they wouldn't comply? Usama, go ahead. Because it's not in writing. That's a good reason. What else? Sorry, we have to. You over here said it doesn't follow the right procedure, which also aligns with Usama's answer in writing. And Alex?
It's not clear they have the authority to order an SMS to be sent at all under the law.
Right. It's not clear that they have the authority. So companies who aren't members of GNI have to navigate situations like this independently and often don't have a framework for dealing with the situation. But GNI member companies have the principles and implementation guidelines to reference and look on to provide guidance to responding to these government demands. The GNI principles, which are based in the UNGPs, are the commitments that members make. And the principles are enumerated in detail on our website and in our materials, but they can be summarized by the following. They are freedom of expression, privacy, responsible company decision-making, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and governance, accountability, and transparency in their most simple terms. So alongside the principles, can we go back 2 slides, please? Thank you. Alongside the principles, GNI's publicly available implementation guidelines give much more detailed guidance about how to implement the principles. Okay, so we have to respect privacy. We have to make decisions responsibly as a company, but what do we need to do in order to do those things? Company functions vary really greatly. Legal jurisdictions vary so much, and every single governmental demand or request really has its own set of circumstances. So we can't make a map for how you should respond to a particular demand. That is to say, so the principles and guidelines are more process oriented. They are more about providing a guidance about what policies and procedures you should have in place in order to make sure that you are making the most responsible rights respecting decision that you can under the legal obligations that you have to obey. Next slide, please. So in a world where Teleworld is a GNI member company, which is the world we will live in for the rest of the scenario, they'll have processes in place to, no, next one. Nope, no. To the red one, thank you. They'll have processes in place to escalate situations like this, and employees would be trained on these processes. Here we've put up some excerpts from our implementation guidelines that detail this. So in procedures, you would have established written procedures that ensure consistent implementation of policies. I won't read every single word on this slide, but you'll also develop escalation procedures for employees seeking guidance. You will make sure that all the employees who are most likely to face such requests know what these procedures are. and you are communicating sorry, you're communicating all the company policies through internal channels to make sure that all parts of the company that need to know what the procedure is. So in this case, this employee knew the procedure to escalate to their CEO and you as the Telegen CEO, and sorry. And also knew to ask for the demand in writing. Next slide, please. So here we have excerpts of our implementation guidelines that apply to both the freedom of expression and the privacy categories. These are the guidelines that say if a demand comes in orally, it has to be brought in writing, unless there is specifically a law that says it can be done orally in emergencies, in which case you have to demonstrate that it's an emergency. You have to give you have to keep records of even the oral demands so that you have a paper trail about what demands you've received. And so on this slide, you can see excerpts from the guidelines about those processes. The employee would know to submit in writing via whatever procedure the company has designated, and referencing the specific local laws and that allow this particular authority to give the demand that they can give. So if I'm this employee, the deputy director of the Office of Public Safety who's given me a call is not the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority. So that is another thing that can be specified. So with this in mind, does anyone have any additional options that you as the Teleworld executive would use in this situation? Anything, any mitigations? Again, by a show of hands. Okay. Well, you can continue to narrow the demand. You can continue to narrow the demand in order to either delay having to comply with it, or in order perhaps to make them see that there is no legal basis for denying it. So now that we are done with demand one, well, now we go to the next one. Regardless of whether or not you complied or did not comply with this demand, you're always going to face consequences. They may be, in one case, if you do not comply and decide that there is no standing to the legal request made, that your employee was arrested. Your employee was arrested, and regardless of whether or not you are right about there being no legal standing, the government can arrest the employee because employees can be held liable as stated in our legal background. So, and if you choose to not comply, the government, if you choose to comply, the Genovian CSOs condemn Teleworld and they organize a boycott of Telegen, which starts to gain traction. There's no way to escape consequences in these scenarios, but we have to make the most responsible decisions that we can in the scenario. Next slide, please. We now have a QR code. If you could please scan or go to it, you will be submitting your own answers to the next question. Okay, we can, I think, go to the next slide. Oh. ¿Qué pasó? We will navigate back to the slideshow. Great, thank you very much. So next slide, please. So now we have the following demand. After the protests that happened in demand one, people began to organize a general strike on social media. Genovians only rely on foreign social media platforms because there are no local ones. And when the government learned of this, they submitted the appropriate form to Telegen. They used the correct procedure to request the identity of every single user who was in the vicinity of the earlier demonstration near the presidential residence after the protest curfew began. At the same time, President Thermopoulos's chief of staff called the Telegen CEO personally and demanded the internet be shut down in the name of national security, pointedly reminding Telegen that it can only provide services in Genovia if it remains in good standing with the licensor. He also told the CEO that Telegen may not disclose the shutdown order. The CEO ordered the chief of staff to the proper procedure and escalated the matter to you in the meantime. These are the considerations you have to keep in mind. The location data will implicate people not just who were in the vicinity because of the protest, but who were there by coincidence. And most of the demonstrators were nonviolent. You sense that the government wants to make examples of the protesters in order to discourage the general strike that's coming. This request may be too broad for legal standing. You're bound by not only local law, but also your home jurisdiction's law, which is a rights respecting one, and by human rights commitments. And depending on whether you decided to comply or not comply with the original demand, your employee is still detained and you're concerned for her safety, and or you are at risk of the boycott that is organized by CSOs for Telegen. So now I would like to ask you to submit your own answers. We know now that it is not simply a binary. You do not simply comply or not comply. It would be great if you could please submit your own answers for mitigations that you would put in place or procedures that would have to be followed in response to this demand, please. Really should have put music on. So, some of the answers coming in say that you may cut off access as requested, complying with the demand, but you can maybe direct traffic to the human rights policy on the error page as a cute little hint. You're also not allowed, oh, I don't know if it said it up here. You're not allowed to disclose the order. You're not allowed to tell anyone that accidentally. You can threaten to leave the market. You could refer the government to the international precedent of the shutdowns that violate the international human rights law. You can ask for demand in writing. You can try to minimize the demand by narrowing it to be as specific as possible. You could hire a good lawyer to apply for bail for the arrested employee, demand accountability by asking the government to establish whether it's an emergency, and threaten investment. You could send a strike team in to rescue the employee. I don't know what companies would do that, but not you. You can refuse to comply with the shutdown order until it's further clarified that you have clarity. You can either stall by asking for clarification on what in the vicinity means or to interpret them. So thank you all for your answers. As you can see, there are many ways that you can handle a situation. So now what you've seen is maybe you were able to successfully negotiate, let's say, a more narrow shutdown. Instead of a complete internet shutdown, you were able to block a specific site, perhaps the specific site that was being used to organize the general strike. Perhaps you were able to simply throttle internet speeds. And of course, neither of these are desirable options, but they are better than a complete internet shutdown. Maybe if you comply in any way, hoping that the government releases your employee, you face consequences from your home jurisdiction. So that is a demonstration of how the GNI framework works in action and how you can see it assist GNI companies in making decisions that relate to these government demands. So in the next panel, you hear a little bit more about situations like this and how this fits into the GNI assessment as we move forward. I would like to pass the microphone over back to Ramsha. Thank you very much for.
Thank you, Don, for that, and for calling David Kay. Okay, so I think I'm going to move to the major chunk of the annual learning forum. I guess we're all really excited to hear our great panelists. Our next panel is our first panel actually for today is going to focus on lessons on GNI assessment. For those of you who don't know, we actually have published our public assessment report recently. And Jason, the executive director of GNI, Jason Pillemeyer, is going to be talking more about in detail what those lessons, key lessons from the latest assessment cycle are in the next panel. But just to give you an overview of what this panel will talk about in addition to the assessments is how to this increase in mandatory corporate accountability and due diligence. There's an uptake in these requirements and legislations, and for instance, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive or the DSA in the European context. So the panel is going to explore how the GNI assessments set in this current regulatory environment, but also on a broader scale, in a bigger picture, what this means for tech accountability. So without more waiting, Jason, over to you for this panel.
Thank you so much, Ramsha, and we can bring up the rest of the panel as well. Annette, Thierry, Hachin, please come join me up here. Yeah, Matthias, I think we have enough chairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think we may need one more chair. Usama is good at standing, but probably wants to sit. Yeah, we can just grab that. I'll use that one since I'm the moderator. So thank you very much to Adon for that helpful exercise. I think for a lot of folks in this room, it was maybe familiar, maybe for some folks in this room, a little too familiar of a hypothetical, but maybe for some of the folks and for some of the audience online who aren't as familiar with GNI and what we do, a helpful illustration of the kind of work we do. As David alluded to and Ramsha mentioned as well, one of the key ways that GNI members come together to talk about situations like this is through our assessment activities. So GNI member companies, when they join, don't just commit to rhetorically follow the GNI principles and more detailed implementation guidelines. They also open themselves up to these independent assessment reviews, which look at their internal systems for how they implement the GNI principles, how their governance is structured, relevant escalation procedures, due diligence, transparency, engagement, et cetera. But we also look at case studies, and that's kind of what sets GNI assessment apart from a typical management systems audit in some ways. And case studies look like Genovia, right? Sometimes similar to that, sometimes very different. One thing to emphasize is the GNI framework and GNI as an organization includes telecommunications companies like Teleworld, but we also have internet companies, we have equipment vendors, we have cloud service providers. So the principles and the process are designed to apply flexibly across the ecosystem, as it were. The assessments are also conducted confidentially, and that's really by necessity in order to be able to have comfort sharing not only sensitive internal company information, but also information about these kinds of interactions that companies are having and the challenges that they're facing around the world. However, we do at the end of every assessment cycle try to share as much as we can about what we've learned about the individual company members of GNI, as well as kind of trends that we're seeing across the ecosystem in the regulatory environment. So we produce a public assessment report. And by coincidence, the most recent public assessment report covering the 4th cycle of GNI assessments was published on Monday. So it's hot off the presses. It's the full copy of the report is available on our website. We also printed out some abridged versions, mini PARs we call them, that are here in the room for those of you who are in person. So feel free to pick one up. It doesn't include the sections on each individual company, but it does include the intro, the about the assessment section that kind of talks through how the assessment process works in detail, and some of the challenges and opportunities that we see coming out of this most recent kind of in-depth look at the scenarios like Genovia. So to kind of unpack that a little bit further and to think about how the lessons that we've learned in the last 15 years through GNI assessment might apply in the context of, as Ramsha alluded to, this emerging mandatory due diligence risk assessment world that that's kind of being built around us. We have an incredible panel, and I'm just super excited to have such a rich group of experts on stage with me to talk through sort of where we are and how we are hoping to support the evolution of mandatory human rights due diligence and ensure that it continues to raise standards rather than limit innovation in terms of good corporate practice, and how GNI and GNI assessments can plug in to these new frameworks. Very quickly, and without doing any justice to their full professional bios, I'll just quickly introduce Thierry Taboy, I try and get the French right, and I fail every time, who is the head of human rights at Orange, a telecommunications company, obviously based in France, as all of you know. Thierry is also a GNI board member. We have Annette Ferguson, who's the co-founder of Threefold Sustainability, which is a business and human rights focused consultancy, but also a former GNI board member in her role at Vodafone. Usama Khilji, who's the director of Bolobi, a digital rights organization based in Pakistan, and also a GNI board alternate for our civil society constituency. Katrin Block-Viberg from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, where she leads the global value chains work at the Danish Institute, and Matthias Verbulen, who's a director at AWO here in Europe, I guess. But Matthias is with us, thankfully, here in Brussels. So, Katrin, I'm going to come to you first. First of all, I just want to say how sort of pivotal and inspirational the work of the Danish Institute has been, I think, for all of us working in this field. The Danish Institute, in many ways, sort of was ahead of the curve in sort of pioneering thinking around corporate responsibility even before John Ruggie's mandate began. So you're building on a really rich legacy and have been working on business and human rights for a long time. Recently, you have been very closely tracking the various EU regulations and legislation that touches on business and human rights, and thinking about, and to some extent helping to shape how they build on and reference this broader international framework of the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. So I'm very curious for your sort of quick story of sort of how we've seen the evolution from the early days of just sort of hammering out what is corporate responsibility and how is that different from state duties, to now states imposing obligations on companies with respect to human rights.
Take this. Thank you so much for that very flattering introduction, and also for inviting me to speak here today. And of course, we've also been following the work of GNI for the past 15 years, and also been very impressed with the way in which you've been conducting your work and working together within with several actors to address some of the impacts associated with ICT companies. So yeah, I'll try and kind of set the scene a bit. Hopefully that's the aim of my introduction. Just to say quickly on the Danish Institute for Human Rights. The Danish Institute for Human Rights is Denmark's national human rights institution. We were established by an act of the Danish Parliament and have been working on the topic of business and human rights, as mentioned, for many years. We started the Business and Human Rights Project back in the late 90s with the aim of trying to clarify to business what is actually their role and responsibility as it relates to human rights. So one of the first activities that we did was to work together with business to develop at the time called the Human Rights Compliance Assessment Tool, which was a resource for companies to, throughout their business, different business activities, assess how in their policies, procedures, and performance that they impact on human rights and relate to human rights, and how they might be better able to further adjust their policies, procedures, and performance to meet international human rights requirements. I'll take a step back from the past 20 years and just say kind of what came before. So what came before us establishing the Human Rights in Business Project, and also all of the developments that we saw in the beginning of the 2000s around the UN Global Compact and the UN norms, and then later also the special procedure mandate on business and human rights of John Ruggie. So just to say that in the 80s and 90s, we really saw, of course, a huge shift towards more globalization, as well as paired with deregulation. So that kind of huge governance gap between seeing more companies operate across several different jurisdictions, paired with the lack of appropriate measures to actually protect against human rights impacts associated with company operations as it relates to working conditions, as it relates to local communities, presented us with this governance gap. We also saw at the time a number of cases coming up in the media as it also relates to the ways in which businesses were negatively impacting human rights in various contexts. And we also saw the emergence of more naming and shaming type activism on behalf of civil society, highlighting some of these negative impacts and risks, and the need for companies to actually take responsibility, but also for the state, of course, to meet their duty to protect human rights in the context of business activities. So what we saw in the 90s and early 2000s is what we might call the kind of CSR era, where you saw kind of the birth of the CSR units within businesses to address some of these impacts. You saw the move within the international systems towards the establishment of some collective norms, at the time called the UN norms, to kind of better set expectations on businesses in terms of what was expected from them in terms of addressing their negative human rights impacts. And you also saw, as I mentioned before, the establishment of the UN Global Compact and the way in which businesses kind of go together around a set of principles and work towards respecting human rights. And then, of course, in 2005, we had the UN appointed the special rapporteur on human rights and business, John Ruggie, and his work was really pivotal in kind of setting the standard of business and human rights. So there were different building stones within, especially the CSR space, and ethics space, and also built on the UN norms, but there wasn't really kind of one collective overarching framework of expectation, which is really what came with the 2008 Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework, as well as the 2011 UN Guiding Principles establishment. And of course, since then, we've seen a lot of work towards the implementation of these guiding principles on business and human rights. In parallel, of course, also the process towards establishing a treaty on business and human rights, which is still ongoing, and things are progressing, while slowly. We also saw, as we also heard yesterday, some of you attended there as well, the integration of the UN Guiding Principles into various other authoritative frameworks, of course, most centrally the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. And in recent years, we've also seen a lot of state action. So now getting to kind of what are we seeing in terms of trends towards more hard law, based on these kind of guiding principles, soft law measures that, of course, refer to international human rights obligations already on the state, but when it comes to the corporate responsibility, still a soft law measure. So what we've seen in recent years since, well, I think one of the first kind of major developments was the UK Modern Slavery Act in 2016, the 2017 Dutch child labor due diligence regulation. Now in the recent couple of years, we've seen the emergence of the Norwegian Transparency Act, the German Supply Chain Act. And then with all of these developments at the national level, in particular within the EU, but we're also seeing developments elsewhere in the world, we are now also seeing kind of regional level bodies starting to increase their focus on how can we better kind of turn these soft law requirements, expectations into hard law. And one of the kind of key policy developments there, as we also heard in the introduction, is of course the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So the Danish Institute for Human Rights has been following both these kind of different national level developments as well as these EU level developments. So it's not only the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it's amongst a suite of different initiatives, including the Reporting Directive, also on sustainability disclosures, as well as a number of issue-specific directives focusing on specific commodities, as well as specific actors such as within the financial sector, and also a whole suite of initiatives around the tech space, as we've heard, on the Digital Services Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act, and of course already existing regulation, which has been in place for a number of years on data privacy through the GDPR. So what I wanted to just end off with is just a summary of some of the kind of key challenges as we look across these various policy initiatives. I think also opportunities for GNI members that have already, through the work around implementation of the standards, been working on these aspects for a long time in conjunction with their other due diligence work. So here, just to say, a couple of points. So first of all, one of the key challenges when looking across the various EU policy files is the issue around language and the way in which reference is made to specific rights in the context of the CSDD. There's an annex outlining specific rights and focus and differences between the different proposals. It's currently under trilogue negotiations, the CSDD. So it'll be interesting to see where it lands in terms of what is the scope of human rights covered there. We are seeing in the DSA, the AI Act, specific reference to fundamental human rights as it relates to the European Charter on Human Rights. So just to say that there are differences in language, but that doesn't mean that the approach to human rights due diligence as outlined in the UN guiding principles and OECD guidelines shouldn't be applied. So just to say that, you know, for me, that is more semantics, but it's an important thing to mention because it does muddy the water, especially for businesses that are a bit concerned with the compliance aspect of having these different kind of definitions or rights mentioned. The second one is on the application. So some of the regulations, of course, apply to larger businesses operating within the EU market. Here, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is one of them. Some of them apply more to specific commodities and the import of those or application of those in the context of artificial intelligence. But just to say that human rights due diligence and the process of identifying, assessing, and addressing risk is covered in the different initiatives in different shapes and forms, but it is covered. Third point on stakeholder engagement. Most of the initiatives are not very strong on this. And that is a key challenge and very important. I'm very happy to be here today as one of the stakeholders within this ecosystem. I think very important that we have very strong stakeholder engagement as a part of our due diligence processes. And just because it isn't very well articulated in the regulation doesn't mean that that's not the expectation as outlined in the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. So really just urging companies to continue stakeholder engagement as a part of their due diligence process. And then finally, on transparency. I think also reading across, there are different levels as to which there is an expectation on transparency. Also as it relates to the specific results of impact assessments. I think, again, very important to emphasize that a part of the due diligence expectation is around transparency. And it's great to see that GNI members are transparent about the type of assessments that they're conducting. And of course, we'd like to see even more transparency also on the fundamental rights impact assessments under the DSA and potentially also under the AI Act.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katrin. That really did help set the table, kind of this long sweep of the history of sort of the evolution of corporate social responsibility into business and human rights, and now the world that we're sort of really beginning to live in now of mandatory regimes, sometimes focused on specific types of harms and human rights, sometimes applying more broadly. And I think one of the reasons why the Danish Institute, GNI, and others have been sort of very much in tune with one another in terms of the positions we're taking is that the more those new laws, whether they're sector specific or risk specific, or applying to kind of global corporate activities or just more narrowly within a jurisdiction, one of the ways that we can help harmonize them and build on the work that's already been done by many pioneering companies is to start on the foundation of these global frameworks, the OECD guidelines and the GNI principles. Matthias, many of us are visitors to Belgium. You are Belgian, and you have been working here in Brussels for many, many years, including in the parliament. You've worked with a number of civil society organizations, and in your current capacity, you've really been one of the leading experts on the Digital Services Act, which is a digital specific law. So it is focusing on a particular sector. And it really, I would say, it does reference in some of the language, the UN guiding principles. But I would say more than explicitly, calling out the UNGPs, it echoes one of the real core components of the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines, which is this concept of risk assessment, right? And sort of making sure that companies have processes in place to understand and mitigate the risks that they face. So it doesn't do a whole lot more than that in terms of the specific detail. There are some provisions. There's a particular article that sort of breaks out the kinds of systemic risk categories, Article 34. But it is something that I will say we are still, and I think many are still trying to understand sort of how it will work in practice. And the other thing that I'll just say as a further sort of T for you is, in addition to conducting the risk assessments, which is now required for those platforms that have been designated very large online service providers or search engines, there is also an audit component. So there's a sort of outside verification, which to some extent looks and sounds like the kinds of independent assessment that GNI does. It's different in some important ways, but there are similarities. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about sort of the DSA risk assessment component. If you agree that it is central, why is it so central? And what are some of the key questions that you and AWO are thinking through in terms of how this will work in practice over time as the DSA really starts to kick in?
Thank you, Jason, and very glad to be here among all of you. Indeed, I think sort of like the risk assessment provisions in the DSA are one of the most innovative parts of the DSA, actually, where you have indeed this sort of threefold sort of set of articles, which starts with Article 34, which basically force very large online platforms, so not every single digital entity, but just this subset of 19 companies to identify, analyze, and assess so-called systemic risks stemming from the design and sort of the functioning of their system. So we're talking about content moderation policies, recommendation engines, and sort of the design features of those systems as well. And then what Article 34 says is that you as a company, you need to assess basically systemic risks in 4 different categories. 2 of them are sort of straightforward to a certain extent, depending on your perspective, I would say. We have this duty to assess risks that focus on the dissemination of illegal content, as defined by national laws in all the European member states. Second category of risk, which we already hinted at it, is basically all the negative effects on all fundamental rights. And then sort of the DSA really highlights 7 key rights, from right to privacy, data protection, non-discrimination, freedom of expression, children's rights, and let me see, what was the last one? No, that's another category, Jason. Consumer rights, exactly. And sort of like, then this is how EU lawmaking goes. There's sort of a story behind every right and why that was specifically being singled out, but that's maybe something for the Q&A. But then sort of the 2 most innovative categories are really focusing on new categories of risks, actually, like things that would not normally be covered by some, for instance, of the GNI processes as well, where the DSA, for instance, forces company to assess any sort of negative effects on quote unquote civic discourse, electoral processes, public security. And then finally as well, which is the broadest and newest category, it also forces company to assess the negative effects on gender-based online violence, public health, minors, and then a very broad category of like negative consequences to physical and mental well-being as well. And so after companies have done these mandatory risk assessments, Article 35 then forces them to take risk mitigating measures and put in place reasonable and effective risk mitigation strategies, which again could be, there are a couple of suggestions in the text ranging from changing your design features of specific products, like making sure that you work with trusted flaggers, work with other companies, change your terms of services. And then interestingly, it's already acknowledged that you can't do everything to counter any sort of risk on your platform, but these are also proportionate in light of your economic capacity as a very large online platform, actually. And we can discuss maybe a bit how that would play out in Twitter's ongoing messy situation, I would say. And then the last part of sort of the risk assessment, risk mitigation, and then is the auditing cycle as well, where indeed sort of an independent, and that's where we are right now in this process in Brussels, where all the companies by the 31st of August had to submit their risk assessments and also say to the auditor like what their risk mitigating measures were that they are proposing to counter those risks. And now we're in the phase that's independent auditors chosen by the companies need to assess these reports, propose risk mitigating effects, and then basically assess on the basis of benchmarks that we don't really know sort of what those benchmarks could be, but the companies themselves have proposed their own benchmarks. I think this is sort of the very first iteration of this whole DSA process at this point in time. And then sort of we will, once the companies will have received these audits reports, 3 months later, they will become public, and then independent experts, like many of those who are in the room with us today, will be able to look at those as well, provide comments, make sort of give criticism, provide criticism to both the regulator, to the companies as well, saying like these benchmarks are not appropriate, like these sort of strategies, or like you have missed risks, A, B, C, D. Like it's one big regulatory experiment where we are right now, I would say. In terms of redress as well, I think very large online platforms, they can be fined once the commission would determine that sort of they haven't done their homework well enough, neither on the risk assessment front or the risk mitigation front. But sort of it's good to acknowledge that nor individuals nor NGOs can actually complain about these risk mitigating measures. Sort of there's no right to redress for individuals because the DSA doesn't really create like new rights for individuals actually. Indeed, sort of like what you were, so the thing that we're looking at, Jason, are sort of like how should these risk assessments be done in practice? What are some of the benchmarks that could be appropriate? I think, for instance, for the fundamental rights and human rights impact assessments, there is a lot of good precedents, there is a lot of good practice. So I would say for 25% of like the risk assessment homework of the companies, there is some precedents. I think we will need to develop a lot more research benchmarks in all these different risk categories as well. And then another question, and which organization asked me in advance as well, is sort of really trying to distill like what is a systemic risk and what makes a risk systemic in the European Union as well. And we have a couple of hints in the text as well, where it says like you have to consider the severity of the impact and the probability of the risk taking place. And then in the recital, it mentions 3 factors almost as a sort of illustration, where they say sort of like one factor that you can take into account is whether it affects a large amount of persons, the potential irreversibility of a specific activity, or like the difficulty to remedy as well. But this is also, I mean, this doesn't give us a lot of guidance as well. For instance, we know that scale is probably important, but at the same time, we know that companies need to make their risk assessment language specific and sort of member state specific as well. So something that could affect 50,000 people in Malta, for instance, that's 1% of the entire population, whereas 50,000 people in Germany is 0.006 of the entire German population. So it's very hard to work with, for instance, clear quantitative benchmarks, for instance, there as well. And there's also the whole issue of cumulative effects, right? So that's one reason why the English language has all these expressions about dead by 1,000 cuts, or the straw that broke the camel's back, basically. Sort of all these sort of minor infractions get up to what is in practice a systemic risk as well. How the companies are going to assess this, how the commission is going to assess this, how auditors are going to assess this is still a really big question mark as well. And to a certain extent, this discussion is a little bit of a house of mirrors, because the commission now has seen all these first, what I hear are extremely large impact assessments from the companies as well. Auditors are sort of having a look at them for the first time as well. So I think somebody of the European Commission is going to come later on as well. Maybe they can shed a little bit of light in what they are seeing as well, actually. Can say something if you, I didn't keep track of time actually, so stop me when you want. But I think that like this is also really the context in which to read the references to the UN guiding principles as well, right? There is one reference to it in the DSA, but it's not really in a part that is linked to the risk assessments, for instance. And it also, it is a very different animal to a certain extent, whereas it has a different scope, it's non-binding, non-enforceable as well, whereas now in the EU is really having this tunnel vision of what the only thing that counts is what is in EU law, what is enforceable, and what are some of the rules that we have now just created within the European Union, actually. So the recital says that, or I think the article says that due regard should be taken to the UN guiding principles. And I think that's how you should contextualize this reference to due regard. It's somewhat lower on the list of priorities or things to take into account, I think. But at the same time, I think that I am quite optimistic as well, because as we've mentioned before, companies who have been doing their homework under the UN guiding principle, for instance, like they have the advantage that they have the experience, the frameworks in place to at least do already some of these human rights impact assessments that are required by Article 34. And also echoing what my colleague was saying here earlier, there is also this mutual interest in really creating a robust stakeholder management process as well, where I think maybe in the future, in the next months or years, GNI can play an important role potentially as well. I think I'll leave it
Thanks so
there.
much, Matthias. No, that's great. And I think exactly as you were saying, right, the UN guiding principles are mentioned somewhat in passing, but when you think about, I mean, so systemic risk, you know, in the UNGP's context, you talk about you talk about salient risks, but when you define those things, the same criteria emerge, right? Is it irremediable, right? Is it the scale, the scope, the severity of the impacts, right? So even if they weren't consciously parallel and sort of as you're saying, Katrine, you know, reflecting the exact same language, the concepts are there, right? They're not so far apart that we sort of have to think, oh gosh, what we've been doing for the last 20 years, pitch it in the trash can, we've got to start all over again. And I think that's a really important point, because I think it leads to the conclusion that you've reached as well, that the companies that have been doing this are a sort of ahead of the game in a sense. The intent, I think, on the part of the commission, both with the DSA and the CSDDD, is to bring up the floor, right? Is to sort of bring other companies that maybe have not been taking these issues as seriously, to really push them to do better, to do more. But I think also critically, and this is where the real challenge is, I think, for all of us going forward, including the commission and in this, to the extent the CS3D is still being negotiated, the Parliament and the Council as well, is how do we set a floor without also creating a ceiling, right? Because the last thing we want to do is say, here is the basic minimum that you need to get by legally, and if you just do that, everything is fine. And then therefore, you don't really have to, in fact, not only do you not have to do anything more, but what would be your motivation to go beyond that, right? What's the incentive there? So that's a good question to ask Annette. So Annette, you've worn a variety of different hats, obviously working within a large global ICT company at Vodafone, and now, you know, consulting with a lot of different ICT companies. You've also been a GNI assessor, right? So you have gone through the GNI assessment process, both having been assessed at Vodafone and then being an assessor. And so you you kind of see, you're paying a lot of attention to what these emerging regulations, how companies are interpreting them. You also have a good sense of how GNI companies have already thought about some of these issues. So just love to hear, some reflection based on your experience about how these new laws, will mesh or not with existing company practice. What are the challenges and opportunities that exist as we move from a kind of voluntary to mandatory framework?
Thanks, Jason. And hi, everyone. Good to be here with you today. So, over the last 2 decades, we have seen good practice, human rights due diligence from companies emerge, voluntary good practice, very much based on the UNGP, on the OECD guidelines. But of course, there are thousands of large companies who don't do human rights due diligence. I think the World Benchmarking Alliance, their last corporate human rights benchmark, which looked at about 130 of the largest food and agri, ICT and automotive manufacturing companies, they found that although about 80% of those companies had some kind of human rights commitment or policy, almost 40% scored 0 on the human rights due diligence indicators. So these are very large global companies who are under scrutiny, who are still not doing human rights due diligence. So, that's the fundamental big picture opportunity that comes from things like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, because more and more companies will have to conduct human rights due diligence, either because they're in the scope of the law or because they're in the value chains of companies who are in the scope of the law. And so it's setting that baseline, that minimum requirement that every company will have to meet. And, everyone will be on the same page, and it will help to drive up that floor that you talked about, Jason. There have been concerns expressed that a mandatory approach might lead to this sort of tick box, bare minimum lowest common denominator compliance approach. And, whenever you get mandatory obligations, there are going to be companies who focus pretty directly at compliance to the letter of the law. And I think certainly for CSDD, a lot of companies will do that at the start because they don't have due diligence processes in place now, and it's going to be a lot of work for them to get those in place. But I think there are others that, who have been doing voluntary human rights due diligence for many years now. And the drivers that were there for them 10 years ago to start doing this, they're still there now. So the mandatory is bringing up the floor, but actually those companies will still have the drivers that were there when they adopted voluntary human rights due diligence before they were required to by law. And I don't think you should underestimate also the kind of power of competition among companies, even in this space. Some companies will want to be leaders, will want to have good practice. And in fact, if you're raising the floor, some of those companies may need to go even further. It may drive them to go even further to maintain a position of good practice, of leadership, of sort of showing the way. So I think the optimist in me believes that sort of those leading companies will continue to be creative, innovative, and go further with their human rights due diligence, rather than kind of drop back to that minimum compliance level. But I think, so I don't think significant numbers will do that drop back. I think practically, what are the practical implications of this? For some companies, the teams who do this inside companies will have to focus for a period of time now on mapping what they do against the legal requirements. And there's quite a lot of different legal requirements, as Catherine pointed out. Mapping what they're doing, what are the gaps? How do I need to fill those gaps? But I think the long-term drivers around leadership, around good practice, around transparency will still very much be there for those leading companies. And I think another really practical thing that people who are implementing this, whether that's from a regulator perspective or company perspective, is human rights due diligence is quite complex. It's not a one-off exercise that once you've done it, you've done it. It's very hard to even do this in a sort of tick box way. most companies will start with maybe a company-wide human rights impact assessment or saliency assessment, where they determine what are their most salient human rights and environmental for the CSDDD impacts. But actually, if you're going to try and mitigate those risks and prevent those risks, you need to go much, much deeper than that and start looking at things like, what are the risks around my product and proposition development side? What are my risks when I enter into a new market or exit a market? What are the human rights risks associated with new business partners, with third-party suppliers, for some companies, even with the kind of sales process and who I sell to? So human rights due diligence is very much a kind of marathon without a finish line. And there's always the room for continuous improvement. And I think that's one of the things that the GNI process very much recognizes, is this kind of continuous improvement and moving the bar always. And also the GNI assessment process and the principles very much look at those different business activities, those different processes around product, around market entry, around M&A. Third parties. So it's that complexity that it's important for people to remember across all of these due diligence. And the additional complexity is everything's always changing. The technology's changing, the operating environment's changing, and therefore human rights due diligence has to be dynamic. It has to respond really quickly to emerging situations. And so actually to comply with what these regulations are asking you to comply with, which is about taking responsibility for your human rights impacts, you have to be continuously sort of ongoing basis rather than this sort of tick box compliance approach.
That's great. Really love your optimism. And I think you're right. I mean, all of the points that you made are very compelling. And in theory, I mean, you are a practitioner within one of these companies. And I think Orange was probably the first, or at least one of the first global ICT companies to be subject to mandatory human rights due diligence. When the French government passed the Loi de Vigilance, the duty of vigilance law, it applied to Orange. It is not a tech-specific law. It covers large companies in France across the board. But you were also a GNI company at that time. And so you were in the interesting position of having already implemented the GNI framework, and then having to sort of turn around and meet these regulatory compliance measures. And then we have since had a chance in the most recent assessment cycle to learn a bit from you as to sort of how those things worked together. And I actually think it's, obviously you can't talk about the specifics, but it's actually quite an encouraging story. And so I would love to hear your reflections on the Loi de Vigilance, how Orange has been approaching those obligations, and how you see that relating to its participation in GNI.
Okay, thank you, Jason. I will complete what you just said, because I totally agree with all your points. But before to answer your question, just a little background, a French little background. 10 years ago, more than 1,000 people working in for the French brands in the textile industry died in the collapse of the Rana Plaza building, raising questions about working conditions of subcontractors for French companies. This is why this tragedy led in 2017, I think, to the drafting of a new law on the duty of vigilance, known as Loi sur le devoir de vigilance in France. So, company with more than 5,000 employees or 10,000 worldwide were concerned. So Orange Group had to comply with the law. Fortunately, on a voluntary basis, we are one of the founding members of GNI, but also for other human rights issues, we are founding members of the Joint Alliance for CSR. That group, this is a group, an alliance with lots of more than 26 telcos that deal with our suppliers in order to be sure that they respect human rights issues like child labor, like forced labor, and modern slavery, etc., etc., but also for fair wages, minimum fair wages, etc. So those two alliances on the work we've done together have been key points in order to enter to this new law, because we learned a lot with GNI in the multi-stakeholder mindset and with the Jack in the question of the whole value chain to take into account. So at the first stage, this law was seen as a constraint by Orange, but thanks to all the things we learned together, we help the CEO and the COMEX, the ex-com of Orange, to understand that it was not just a constraint, it was an opportunity, because it was becoming mandatory. And when it's mandatory, it's one of the main conditions to help the transformation of our company towards a fair and sustainability model. So that's why we develop our governance, the assessment process, etc., and we choose some of aspects linked to GNI, some others to Jack, etc., and we have more than 26 countries, so it's huge, you know. So we're in a good place, and as you say, we have to go further. This is good to be one of the leader regarding the law of the vigilance, the duty of vigilance. It's good to be a leader, but we have to go further, and we see the new CS3D act or law directive as a chance, because first of all, it creates the conditions to standardize the European legislative landscape, and for us it's very important on a competitive point of view. So on what the European directive broadens the scope of the French law, okay, numbers of companies, the dynamics, etc., etc. It's quite the same that the French law. So we're ready. So just to finish and to show that we want to go further, I have just 3 messages to pass to the audience. The first one, say for the companies who which will be involved in that new directive, look it at an opportunity, a business opportunity. Secondly, I think it's very important to work with the finance division in order to create new KPIs that are hard ones in direct line with our purpose. For example, avoid cost, impact on our brand value, etc., etc., etc. So within Orange, we are trying to define that kind of indicators, and I think it's very important. And the third things I want to share with you is that it's very important to take into account not only our suppliers in a co-petition view, but also all our ecosystems, because regulation has to be balanced with innovation, and it's very important to help our ecosystem, especially SMEs, to comply with all that new regulations things, but they have not the capability to do this alone. So it's one of our purpose to help them to be in a good way in order to comply and to be more and more strong in that field.
That was excellent. Thank you, Thierry. And I think actually that last point is a really good segue. I will say, we've been having a lot of conversations this week with folks from the European Commission and Parliament and others. And I do want to just acknowledge that I think, I give a lot of credit to folks here in Europe for understanding that these laws will have global implications. And whether that is implications in terms of changing structurally the way the companies do content moderation, and that might affect the situation even outside of Europe, or implications because companies in Europe will be required to push some of these obligations down to suppliers and to other business relationships. And there is, I think, a recognition that the Commission itself should also assist in terms of some of its development assistance and the work that needs to be done to build up better rule of law in the countries that are linked to this broader ecosystem. Our last speaker for this panel is Usama Khilji. Usama, you live and work in Pakistan, which is one of the most difficult places to work on digital rights issues, I would say. And you do incredible work there. We've heard a lot about sort of this European legal framework that's emerging. We'll hear more about the online safety bill in the next panel. It's not just the EU. There are
joining
a lot of governments
because of the
moving into the
IFF.
space, but most
That's
of
what
them
I
are in
heard. That's the last I
global north.
heard.
A lot of their
Yeah.
political focus is, of course, on what's
Yeah.
happening in their backyard because they have to
I'll double
respond
check
to
with
their constituents.
but I'm pretty sure he
But
is.
yet, as we saw from the recent
joining.
request for information that the Commission issued with respect to content
Yeah.
moderation and what's happening online in response to the Gaza
Yeah.
Israel situation, there's not an easy geographic boundary to draw around Europe, right, or around any country.
If you want to join that one.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what opportunities and challenges you see as large global companies are required, more and more of them, to comply with these laws.
Okay.
What will that mean for users in places like Pakistan? What does that mean for how the government in Pakistan is thinking about and talking about its own approach?
Okay,
to
great. So
regulation?
maybe I'll join
Any
that.
other reflections you might want to share?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
yeah, that's-
So I'll start off a bit by talking about the GNI assessment process, and really how it's been instrumental in involving the voices from the majority world, and especially in terms of how we interact with companies, well, GNI member companies, through the assessment process. And then I'll move on to the risks that the regulatory proposals and the past acts in Europe and the implications they have for the majority world. So I'm aware that the GNI assessment process is quite confidential. So for those of you who may not be familiar with it, I just want to quickly walk through the process. So because it's a multi-stakeholder model, so you have 4 constituencies. So you have the companies, the academics, the civil society, and investors. So it's loosely divided into company members and non-company members. So whenever there's an assessment cycle, the non-company members get together and we have a case selection working group. And what that group does is essentially solicit cases that members may want the company to focus on when they're carrying out their assessment. So that really gives an opportunity for a wide membership base. And if you look at the data right now, I think it's something like 68% majority world membership of GNI. They have the ability and opportunity to propose cases from their own jurisdictions that they want GNI to assess the member companies on. And then what happens is then the case selection group has regular conversations with the company and their assessors through the process in case there are any questions they want to. So it's quite an inclusive process in that sense. And then once the assessment takes place, what happens is that the reports by third-party auditors, I would say, are presented to the non-company constituency. And we have study groups that study the assessments in detail, debate them before the board meetings. And once the assessment or board meeting takes place, we pose a lot of questions, most of which are submitted in advance. So this entire process takes more than a year. It's around 2 years where, step by step, all of this is happening. So it's really one of the very few opportunities that civil society organizations and really citizens from those countries through the civil society organizations have in order to communicate in a formal manner with companies that have huge influence and operating presence, in all of the world. So in that sense, it's key that we're able to use the multi-stakeholder forum such as GNI to do that. So now, when we look at the GNI member companies, the improvement over time aspect is really key. And if you look at third-party like rankings, like RDR, Ranking Digital Rights, it's mostly GNI companies that perform the best in those rankings because of the assessment cycle and system and how we're holding the companies accountable over time. So we're saying, okay, you did well 2 years ago, but what did you do after those 2 years, right? So you need to prove that you're doing better. And I think that metric really works. And Jason already alluded to something that I was thinking of, oh, should I mention it or not? But, one of the companies in the assessment cycle was able to use the regulatory mandatory due diligence assessment in the GNI assessment. So to show that it doesn't have to be separate, right? So there is that possibility of combining the two. So now I'll come to the risks that it really poses, right? So if large companies are focusing on large scale assessments within Europe, then they risk not giving enough attention to jurisdictions beyond Europe. And I think that's a key concern that we have. And especially if companies are doing assessments based on what the European assessment or regulations require them to do, the likelihood is that the group headquarters will focus on the European markets more and not on their subsidiaries in the global majority. So I think that's one concern that does come up. And secondly, also, if you have large internet platforms, then their focus on the global majority will not be enough. But then that leads us to the risk that you posed in the question also, is how are governments in the global majority looking at this model? So we've seen the impact of the net ZG model. What was it? Net ZG in Germany, and then the Avia law in France. And even though there are strong rule of law and parliamentary processes in Germany and France where people are able to, get the laws struck down once they're passed or amend them, in other jurisdictions, they're saying, oh, this is happening in France and Germany, so why can't we do this, right? So really using that opportunity to replicate those laws in order to clamp down on dissent and freedom of expression and privacy rights through such regulations. So in that sense, I think co-regulation models work better because you have internal accountability and a sense of competition within companies that we see in models like the GNI. But when you bring in regulations through the state, then you risk the replication of that in the global majority, where governments are more than enthusiastic in wanting to clamp down on those fundamental rights. And, the impact of which then we see regularly. So I think that's one risk that needs to be debated globally also, and through other engagements of the EU. So for example, the EU has the GSP plus mechanism in trade partners. So what they would say that, okay, you're a partner, we do a lot of trade. For example, the EU does a lot of trade with Pakistan. But what they will do is they'll give them preferential treatment in trade and tariff concessions based on their human rights performance. So they'll say, okay, we'll renew the GSP plus status in 2 years if Pakistan passes these laws protecting these human rights issues, and if Pakistan's able to, show that there are human rights protections in place. So that sort of encourages other governments to, focus on human rights. And as civil society organizations, we also, interact with the EU you in this process and sort of say that, okay, this is something that you need to focus on in asking Pakistan when you're reviewing this status? So there are mechanisms for the EU to sort of push that in a formal way, and what better way than economic incentives in trade? But I think that also risks that checkbox mentality where they're like, yeah, we've passed these laws, but are they really being implemented? Is the question. So the accountability in that sense needs to be there.
Thanks so much, Osama. Netzwerk Durchsetzungsgesetz. That's DG. I don't think I said it right, but yeah, no, I mean, so there is this sort of Brussels effect, right? Where, you know, we've already seen a number of jurisdictions say, oh, Digital Service Act sounds good to me. Let me, you know, do something very similar and I'll use a similar name. And, you know, you can't criticize me because you're doing something like that, right? We just want our own version. And there is what I've sometimes called the dark Brussels effect, which is what you were also pointing to, which is the DSA says very clearly, no, you need to address these risks in Europe, right? If you have, you know, if the companies increase the amount of money they are spending on, to take a narrow piece, content moderation, then they can continue to do that in a lot of different jurisdictions. But if there is a set budget for that, and all of a sudden the consequences of not doing that effectively in Europe are quite severe, and at least can result in sort of immediate financial consequences in terms of fines, but the consequences in other places don't have those material consequences, then you can imagine, you know, how difficult that becomes internally. So we have just a few minutes, I think, for Q&A. Unfortunately, this was really fantastic. We've covered a lot of really good ground. I want to turn to the audience and see if there are any burning questions. And I will also check our online questions. But anyone, Isabel, go there first. Actually, maybe we'll take both your questions and then come back to the panel.
Thank you. Very interesting panel. Isabel Ebel from the UN Human Rights BTEC project. So reflecting on Pillar 1, the state duty to protect, also with regard to what we've been seeing in terms of progress in the last 10 years, but also some of the challenges. And I think it was really interesting to hear from Orange, how they perceive some of the legislation. I want to reflect on some of the performances we see in the rankings, and to which extent we can, I mean, and we know that the GNI companies perform relatively well, but the idea is also to raise the bar, and I think get other companies to also really have a proper quality of rigor when they're assessing impacts, and to move towards better practice in the whole sector. So I wonder, I mean, that goes to a couple of the participants. If you put your if you put yourself in the shoes of a state, evidently you're responsible for your citizens and protecting them, and you want to raise the bar in terms of conduct. At the same time, you have these unintended consequences to a certain degree in other jurisdictions. How are you supposed to deal with that?
Yeah, thank you so much. What a fantastic panel, such an interesting discussion. I'm wondering if you could also put yourself in the shoes of platforms. And particularly, I really liked the vision that was painted by this panel on how kind of this regulatory world and the pre-regulatory world, the self-regulatory world can coexist. And I see that there is a lot of optimism and possibilities for that vision. In my view, what I can imagine is an obstacle to that becoming a reality is when going above and beyond the standards that are required by law can actually create compliance risks. Saying like you allow a lot of scrutiny of your company and you say, you know, I want to involve a lot of stakeholders, I want to give a lot of transparency because I did it all the time and I want to be a leader in this. But then you might also look at now here in the EU to the Commission and be worried that they might point at all of this work that you do and say, well, maybe you don't actually do the best that you could because there's still a lot of people that are kind of unhappy with what you do. And then I wonder what kind of assurances like would companies kind of require to go above and beyond without facing compliance risks that might kind of prevent them from doing so.
One thing is for sure, compliance lawyers are going to have a lot of work over the next few years. And I'm not sure that's a good thing, but you know, those are important questions. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Isabel. There's also a question online that we got that I'll just read out. Based on the regulatory developments discussed, how will this impact the GNI assessment methodology going forward? I swear I didn't plant that question. But a lot of shoes to put on, the shoes of the states, the shoes of the platforms, and my shoes. I won't ask anyone else to put my shoes on, but maybe we'll just start with you, Matthias, and kind of come back around. Thoughts on any of those questions, whichever ones you want to engage with.
Yeah. Maybe on the first thing, sort of like what to do if your state, if I were a state as well. I mean, I think one thing to really clearly keep in mind is that sort of many countries in the majority world, including some of the more authoritarian-minded countries as well, like they don't need the EU as an excuse to adopt draconian laws that have an impact on right to privacy or freedom of speech, I think. And I think that's sort of like, it's, of course, it's not super helpful if they can literally copy paste specific segments of European law, because then the scope in the international fora and in diplomacy to criticize that is like much lower, of course. But I think that sort of the bottom line is that, or there's still this thing as like regulatory sovereignty, right? Like you as a state have the power to regulate and take sort of those legislative decisions that you think are appropriate for sort of the jurisdiction that you're responsible for. Because if that's not the case, then you can basically not adopt any sort of laws, because everything will be able to be put out of context by any sort of ill-meaning regime as well, actually. So that's what I would say if I would diplomat. Fortunately, I'm not working for a state, no ambition there as well. I mean, as a platform, I think it's unlikely, like this particular conundrum that you are painting, it's like rather unlikely, I think. Like I haven't really come across like a lot of platforms who want to go above and beyond the law to solve some of these things as well. Like I think what's going to be a much more pressing problem is sort of conflicts of laws and conflicting legal obligations because of sort of the vagueness of law in one particular jurisdiction that then can clash with sort of other legal obligations, sort of, not to name the UK, for instance, as an example, as well. But even within the EU, right, where you have sort of GDPR versus DSA conflicts, and so as you say, Jason, it's a lawyer's paradise. So I'm happy with my profession.
Just a few points. I think you have to keep in mind that you need to have a systemic view when you work in a group as Orange, which is present in Europe, but also in Africa. So this is the main content. So the systemic view on the Think Global, Act Locally. So you have to take into account the culture, for example, in order to respect that. For example, it's difficult to avoid child labor in Africa regarding SIMs vendors. SIM cards vendors, because it's familiar as a kind of they are proud to give some answers to their children. So you can't just say, okay, we will make some audits and we will stop working with you if you continue to make your children working. It's not possible. You have to imagine an incentive way in order to answer the question. Secondly, you have to have a strong assessment basis. So this is why GNI, for example, is very important. It helps us a lot. Especially in Africa, for example. And don't forget that regarding platforms, etc., storytelling is key, but it has to be based on facts, on data, and you have to develop for that incarnated KPIs.
So I've been thinking about the question around that, can going above bring compliance risk, and trying to think of, are there examples of some of these laws that have already been in place for a period of time that have done that? So the vigilance law, the modern slavery law in the UK, and I can't think of anyone, but I'm happy to be corrected. But I think for human rights due diligence laws, something like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it is about establishing policy process risk assessment rather than performance is the wrong word, but rather than actual outcome, really. And so it's hard to see scenarios where going beyond on your due diligence activities brings you greater compliance risk, but I'm sure someone can probably think of something. Maybe Catherine.
No, actually I can't. And I totally agree with your point. And I was about to make the exact same point. And I think also, it might be a lawyer's paradise, but, I think also there's a shift in these regulations. They represent also a bit of a shift in the way in which we perceive law and regulations in terms of what is required. So as mentioned, these are more process-oriented regulations. And actually, it's not a, compliance kind of do no harm, here you go. It's actually about explaining, okay, what was your due diligence? What did you identify? How did you address it? How transparent are you? How have you included stakeholders in that process, etc.? So it's actually a shift in terms of that kind of more traditional compliance thinking. And there is actually a large debate within the legal community around how to deal with that, and also a lot of need for additional capacity of the legal community to actually engage in that in a meaningful way and constructive way. And there, again, there is a big role for the people within the companies working on this, some of which are lawyers, to help also explain that difference in approach, and to insist on, especially as their role as human rights advisors or sustainability leads, on their central position and role in ensuring implementation and compliance with the regulation. Then just quickly on the state duty to protect, and I think just to add there, I think there also is a certain level of maybe, Isabel, if I understood your question correctly, it also had to do with kind of what can home states do in terms of, when companies are operating contexts. And of course, there is in the guiding principles both a reference to kind of enacting policies, regulation, etc., but also providing guidance and resources and supporting businesses in their due diligence. So as a minimum, of course, home states can also use some of these more softer measures in terms of clarifying expectations to businesses, even though the regulation, the DSA, potentially also the AI Act in terms of the application will also only cover kind of impacts in the European market. There could still be a certain level of trying to kind of support businesses in applying similar types of thinking and risk identification also in other contexts, and of course to disclose on how they're doing that as more of a kind of soft measure instead of a hard regulatory requirement. Of course, the CSCD to some extent may cover that, may set that requirement on business, but that would only cover some of the larger companies and may not cover all of the actors involved in those specific tech activities.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's important to look towards the UN as well. So you have the UN guiding principles that are there. And I know in South Asia and several countries, the UN has worked with governments to come up with national action plans on business and human rights. And interestingly, the Pakistan one mentions the GNI as well. So there is some progress happening there, where governments are starting to encourage businesses to take human rights seriously and providing a framework and methodology through a national action plan, but it remains voluntary, not mandatory. So that's key.
Wonderful. Great responses. We're over time, so I'm not going to punt on the last question, but I will say we're actively discussing and thinking about how GNI assessment methodology will need to evolve. And I think the important thing for everyone to understand is that GNI's assessment methodology has continuously evolved, right? From the beginning of GNI assessment through this most recent cycle. Some of you have been a part of that evolution, and we will continue to evolve it. We are thinking very carefully about how the regulatory requirements that different member companies face might create efficiencies and opportunities to make the GNI assessment process easier, but also might require us to think about different ways in which we can help tailor assessment to make companies, to better position companies to meet their regulatory requirements. So it is going to evolve. We welcome more conversations about that with all of you. Just really thrilled to have had such an incredible panel with such deep expertise. Thank you so much for being here. I believe we now go to a coffee break. So I get to release you. Please grab a quick coffee. We will come back here. I think let's aim for 4 o'clock, which is 7 minutes. I know we won't actually do that, but let's aim for that. And then maybe, a couple of minutes after that, we'll come back. The second panel is going to be really, really interesting. So you don't want to miss it. All right. Thank you all.
All right. Is this working? So it's not working.
Hello, hello. Check, check.
No, it's not.
Hello, hello. Yeah.
All right, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. So if you all can be seated, please, that would be great.
We'll invite you. You can sit there and be. So we're sitting in them. I will.
Hopefully we all got some coffee and are feeling more awake because the next conversation is just as interesting and insightful. The next panel is actually contextualizing and understanding the implications of European regulations on the rest of the world, as we briefly spoke about in the first panel as well. To talk about the impact on global majority, I would like to invite the moderator for the panel, Iverna McCohen, who is the director of CDT Europe and leading a very, very competent team in Brussels and leading work on European policy. So over to you, Iverna.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for hosting this really important event and for the invitation to join you as a moderator today. I'm very happy to moderate what's going to be the best panel of the event. And excited. It was really set up, and thank you. That first panel, I think there was already a lot of indication about how important this panel will be, because we are going to take a deeper dive into this question of what will be the global implications of some of the new legislation and regulations coming from both North America and from the European Union. You know, how will that play out for better or for worse in the majority global majority countries? And I am very honored to have a very esteemed panel. If I can maybe ask the panel to come and join us here, and then I'll introduce you until you're here. So you've got look at everybody up here, and then I shall introduce you so that we've got faces to introduce. Thank you. So I'm going to just so that I can actually see your reactions and create a bit of a moderator dynamic here. So I am really honored to have a fantastic panel up here. Gabrielle Guillemin, who is working at Meta on human rights. We've got Owen Bennett, who is working at Ofcom on international online safety. Eduardo Bertoni, who's a former special rapporteur, OAS, and former director of the Argentinian Data Protection Authority, and of course a GNI board member. Lilian Nalwaga, program management specialist, collaboration on international ICT policy for East and Southern Africa, also GNI board member, and Konstantinos Komitis, non-resident fellow, Atlantic Council, and senior policy advisor at GNI. I literally asked you if you were on this panel and you told me you weren't. I'm on to you. So thank you all so much for joining us. And just as I was listening to the introductory panel today, indeed that first panel, I myself have to admit that I am a business and human rights nerd. I'm not going to age myself, although maybe I will by saying this. Many years ago, I was an intern at the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I was doing my master's thesis on business and human rights, and had the great privilege that the intern's office was actually right beside the late great Professor John Ruggi's office at the time. And what really struck me in listening to some of these conversations this morning is that back then, 2 years ago, it was really very theoretical. The whole concept at that stage that you could have any form of more formal corporate accountability, that there was implications for how different companies operated. So it has been really an extraordinary journey that's brought us here today, and what makes it so timely. And for this conversation now that we're really at a stage where we're not talking about things that are no longer abstract, but we're talking about hard laws, for better or for worse, as today's conversation will talk about, and that's really important. And obviously the really important role that GNI has played in along that way in bringing these norms to fruition, so to speak. So as I said, we're going to talk a little bit in this session about what are some of the global implications of some of these laws. Also, how will these new laws and obligations play out with what companies are already doing? So I'm going to come to you first, Gabrielle. Obviously, you are leading a lot of the work in Meta human rights policy, and obviously, we also know you from your previous work in civil society as well. So we know you're a deep expert on the DSA and others. It'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts in particular. What are the gaps and overlaps you see between the approaches a company like Meta has already taken? I mean, you've already been under a lot of scrutiny in terms of human rights and due diligence, compared to what is now coming with this new legislation. Where do you see those gaps and overlap, and what's the approach that you'll be taking facing all these new obligations?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us today. It's a pleasure to be with this panel. And, you know, among so many familiar faces. If I may, I'd like to start by, you know, showing one of the things that you can do as in a self-regulatory way. And so today I brought with me, and doing now a shameless plug, for Meta's second annual human rights report. And I'm bringing this up here because in it, we talk about our salient human rights risk assessment. So I think it's an interesting thought experiment to see, like, this is something that our team did, that we're committed to doing under our corporate human rights policy. And as we see the various requirements that come up, I think it will be good to see how different frameworks and requirements, obligations, what this means for transparency moving forward. And I very much hope that next year you'll see me or someone from my team showing you what we're still doing in this voluntary space. And I would stress, of course, that this is quite different from what Meta as a whole has been doing under the DSA, but just to see like what can be done from a voluntary, you know, self-regulated perspective. So now, going to your question, I think the first thing I'd highlight is just that we're only 2 months in of the DSA being in force for Facebook and Instagram. So I think like many things are still very much in an iterative phase. There's many things that that we don't know. I think it's a learning experiment for companies, but perhaps also to some degree for regulators as we grapple with what these obligations mean. So I think it's really important context to bear in mind. And in the case of the DSA, I think we hope and we'll probably see a lot of supplementary guidance that will come in and will be very much welcome in many different areas, for example, around trusted flaggers or even the risk assessments themselves. So that's just for background. Now, looking at you know, how we compare the DSA and the GNI process, I think there's many opportunities, but they're different. I think the previous speakers have already alluded to, you know, how different they are. The GNI is very much focusing on government requests, and it is very much focused on the rights to free expression and privacy. Whereas we've seen under the DSA that it's much wider ranging. There are extensive transparency requirements. there's very specific mechanisms. There's something on notice and action. There's under Article 9, but also under Article 16 of the DSA. And there is also these risk assessments, which are very much about what the companies themselves are doing and how they're impacting rights. So the scope of those are different. But as I mentioned, like certainly one of the things which, both regulators and GNI could learn from is, the GNI experiment and, for example, how to respond to government requests, for instance. So that's certainly an area that where there could be learnings. And of course, as we've heard, many in this room already have a lot of experience working with the UNGPs, whose concepts are quite similar to what is found in the DSA. Now, in terms of how Meta is thinking about regulation, I think many of you will already be familiar with some of our efforts. We have regular posts on our website where we explain about how we think about these things. And it's very much in terms of these different buckets that I alluded to. So first, transparency. Second, the notice and action mechanisms, as well as, the bulwark of like intermediary immunity from liability. And then those risk assessment. And of course, it's a major priority for the company. And we've already been doing a lot of work on this. And as I learned when the newsroom post was posted, over 1,000 of us have been working on this across policy, products, law, legal, compliance. So many different teams have been involved in this work, and really thinking about and setting up a compliance function with a DSA compliance officer based in Dublin. And so in the way the company's been thinking about this is very much like starting from a lot of the positive experiences they want to give to our users, and looking at like a lot of the things we're already doing in terms of transparency, and that we're also doing in relation to access to research, and so it's building on those and to meet our obligations under the DSA. Now, I guess what we'll have to see is really how, as this other countries look to the DSA and how it's enforced, like, what might be the effects more broadly. But again, that's something that's very much in play and that we'll have to see. So I'll stop here and see if some of my other co-panelists want to respond to.
Sure, thank you. And actually, a point I would like to come back to later, I think the point on trusted flaggers and the fact that unfortunately in civil society we lost the battle of having law enforcement as trusted flaggers. There's still an opportunity to play with, because at national level they could decide whether or not, which is an interesting dynamic, to have law enforcement as trusted flaggers. But let me come over to you, Owen. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about EU legislation here, but there's also been a very significant piece of legislation. I don't know if the King has signed it yet, if we can say it's been passed, but it's online safety bill. So it'd be really great if you could just bring us up to speed a bit about what's going on in the online safety bill. We know, Owen, by the way, we trust you that it'll be implemented in a way that protects end-to-end encryption, of course. They asked me to be a moderator, but I'm a human rights advocate too, so I'll slip that in there. We know you can do that for us. So we're really interested to understand how Ofcom sees the role and opportunities on that piece of legislation, in particular how you'll manage that element of engaging with stakeholders, which is obviously a key point under the GNI as well.
Super. Thank you very much, Iverna. And thank you very much for the opportunity to explain a little bit the bill, but more importantly, to explain like what we'll be doing as Ofcom and how we'll be working both internationally and with third parties around the world to bring it to fruition and make sure it's set up for success. Obviously, it's not too often we get so many human rights practitioners and activists in the room together. So this is a really great opportunity for us, and we're very grateful for it. In terms of where things stand, very quickly, so the bill is still a bill. It's not yet an act, but our sources in the palace tell us that within the next 24 hours, it will indeed become an act. And then the fun really begins, because I'm not sure if any of you have had the joy of reading the online safety bill. It is a very onerous text. It's like 300 pages long. But one thing which is very interesting in it is that the bill, if you do a Control F on your browser to see how many times a word is mentioned, it mentions Ofcom over 1,000 times. So the bill and the act is not really an act without Ofcom. And so now that's why we have to really, really get to work to bring it to fruition and to fill in all of the gaps and all the detail which will need to be supplied for this thing to actually work in practice and to make a difference. In terms of what we will be doing at a high level. So once the bill is passed, the next step is for Ofcom to start to produce our regulatory guidance and our recommendations for how services can comply with their duties. That will be starting very, very soon. The first set of documents are ready to go. We're just waiting for the King to sign. So they will be published early in November, first couple of weeks in November. And what they will be doing is setting out our vision for how companies who are subject to the law should be assessing the risks of illegal content on their services. Now, this is very similar to the DSA framework. There is a duty for services to assess a variety of risks. However, the main difference for our framework is that that duty applies to all services, not just the very large services. So we will be publishing guidance on how services can do that, and we'll also be publishing a set of recommendations for how services can tackle illegal content. And then this will be followed later on in 2024 with follow-on guidance for how services can comply with their duties around protecting children. So children's risk assessments, but also protecting children from a broader variety of harms which are laid out in the law. So that's going to be quite a long process, and these are all consultation processes. So once these are published, we hope that these are quite comprehensive, but we're also expecting that from folks within this room, but also the broader policy community, we do hope to receive feedback and recommendations on how they can be improved before they are finalized. So in terms of what we're actually hoping to achieve, I thought it might be useful to kind of give a bit of an overview of our regulatory strategy, because the bill is going to come into force, but it's going to exist for a very long period of time. And we expect that once all of these regulatory documents are published, there will still be constant ongoing work for us and for companies to ensure that it is continuing to be effective and that it is driving improved safety outcomes. So going forward, there's kind of four main things that we'll be focusing on. The first is providing resources for compliance. Like we're very aware that these kind of regimes, whether it's the Online Safety Act in the UK or the DSA in the EU or many of the other regulations around the world, these are quite new. They're asking companies in many cases to do things that they've never done before, or else they're asking companies to maybe change processes or tweak things to make them in compliance with a different set of rules. And we're conscious that it's difficult to leave companies to do that in a vacuum. So a main focus, and one of the reasons why Ofcom is mentioned so many times in the law, is because we have a duty to provide the guidance and the resources to help companies achieve the outcomes. So that's going to be a major focus of us for the next 4 to 5 years, is providing those resources, making sure that they work for companies, but also making sure that they have privacy and freedom of expression in mind, because that's of course one of our duties under the UK human rights framework, is to ensure that that those fundamental rights are upheld at all times in regulation. The second big focus of our regulatory work is going to be trying to drive improvement, because ultimately these, I think it was mentioned in one of the previous panels, that these aren't really bright line rules. It's not like there is a law and you just have to stay on one side of it and then you'll be left alone. These are kind of ongoing iterative processes whereby companies will be, like, over time expected to demonstrate their due diligence. And those require ongoing relationships between us as a regulator and them as companies. So a big focus of what we'll be doing is trying to build those relationships, most of which we hope will be trusted ones, where we have a collaborative and constructive relationship with the companies, but in every instance trying to ensure that the companies are doing a better and better job at assessing the risks, mitigating the risks, and also protecting rights. So for the largest companies, that will involve a one-to-one relationship. But then, of course, given that there's many thousands of companies that will be within scope of the bill, we'll have to think of some more innovative ways to help companies comply, keep them on track without necessarily having such a intensive working relationship with them. The third piece is about assuring compliance, because ultimately, I think it was also mentioned by our colleague from Orange that in many cases, compliance and human rights due diligence is good for business and it's good for the bottom line. But unfortunately, for some companies, that might be a bridge too far, and sometimes you need to use your regulatory tools. So a big focus of our work in the short term will, one, be trying to understand the landscape to the extent that what is the gap between what many companies are doing today and what they should be doing to protect people from harm. And if there is a shortfall, how do we fix that? Whether it's through the various enforcement levers, trying to find a way of, hopefully without having to use too rigorous methods, but getting to a point where companies are at least meeting the minimum standards to protect people. And we have a range of powers, but also a range of safeguards to ensure that we're operating in a proportionate and necessary way with that. And the final piece I will just mention on that front is trust and transparency, both of ourselves and of the companies. Because obviously, especially when we think about global impacts, given that these laws are quite new, we're also acutely aware that we are, as a regulator, being given powers that bring huge responsibility and could also be very easily misused. So a big focus of our work is for ourselves, but also for the companies we regulate, being as transparent and being as open as possible about what they are doing and what we are asking them to do. So that involves every year publishing a report on our regulatory strategy, what we have done, how we have worked with the companies, but also specifically providing routine and regular updates on how we are protecting fundamental rights in our regulatory work. Because ultimately, if we don't do that, we won't bring people with us. And then the kind of, sometimes you hear a critique in the UK that Ofcom is going to be the speech regulator. And so we have a lot of work to do to ensure that we maintain that trust and that the power and the authority that's been given to us by government and by the public is one that is vindicated. And I'm conscious that there's so much more things to be discussed, but maybe one final thing I'll mention is just the actual obvious international context of all of this. Like in the UK, as Ofcom, we're acutely aware that we're not operating in a vacuum, that there's many, many other jurisdictions around the world who are pursuing these objectives as well, but also that whatever we do may also have ramifications elsewhere. Hopefully some of those ramifications could be good ones, but they can also be bad ones sometimes. So international engagement is quite a big priority for us. We have a team, which I sit on, which is 5 people who are focused just on international online safety, which that might not seem like a lot, but amongst our regulatory counterparts, that actually is quite a lot. Most regulators don't have the resources or don't want to invest the resources in that kind of international work. So we are trying to step up in that regard. And with that, a big focus of ours is we don't want to be in a position where we're kind of saying our approach is a blueprint for the world. We have ideas that we think work, as in we think that regulation, which is backed by an independent regulator, which has duties under human rights law, is a good thing. And we think other countries should try and replicate that. But our job, we don't see our job as saying, this is the OSB, this is Ofcom, you go do it in your jurisdiction. And we think there's a fine balance to be struck there between explaining our approach, but also not trying to impose standards where other jurisdictions might have other reasons for adopting different ones. So we try to strike that balance, but also a big priority is ensuring that to the extent that we have a vision for how we think things should be done in the UK, trying to work with partners who also have visions to try and make some sort of international coherence. And that's where things like the GNI principles and the assessment framework can be incredibly useful. We recognize that it's applicable for many different regulatory regimes and that many of the companies complying with the GNI rules are doing these risk assessment processes in many parts of the world. So looking for those opportunities where there is existing instruments which drive that kind of alignment, interoperability, coherence, and trying to uplift those and learn from those is something which we spend a lot of time trying to think about. There's so much more I would love to talk about in terms of the work we're doing now and the third-party aspect, but I will pause there because there's a lot more things I would like to hear.
Thank you, Owen. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions as well. You mentioned a really interesting and important point that we should not, presume that what works in one jurisdiction will work in another. And indeed, at CDT, with regard to the Digital Services Act, we've been highlighting that towards the European Union and its foreign policy and delegations to warn to say, look, if you have a content moderation law, but in a certain jurisdiction, you do not have any privacy laws, then obviously that could be a very strange mix and have all kinds of unintended consequences, which actually brings me, Eduardo, to one of the questions I'd like to ask you. As mentioned in the introduction, you've had a very impressive and varied career, including, very interestingly, being the head of the Argentinian Data Protection Authority at the time when the GDPR came into force. So you obviously have that direct experience of what was that global implication and impact, and what do you think from that experience? What are the lessons that we can learn and draw from that as we now enter this new phase with different types of global regulation?
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me in this panel. I guess that is what I want to say is in some way a continuation of what my colleagues just said and what the other panel was presenting. I would like to touch on or to do a presentation of three points. The first one, which is pretty obvious maybe for this audience on this panel, is that I will argue that there is a global impact on what I will call the Brussels effect, because we can ask it is or it is not a global. The base of my presentation is that there is a global impact. If it is good or bad, this is another conversation. I will say something about that. Second point, the Brussels effect consists, in my view, not only in transposition of rules, but also on, I would say, political pressure that is mainly linked to economic reasons. And I will explain that. And my third point for this afternoon is that I will argue that global impact of EU regulations to be effective depends on the acceptance of those who are targeted. And when I say those who are targeted, it's not only states, but the private sectors and company as well. Those are my 3 points for my presentation. So the first one, global impact, that it is something tangible. I focus on transposition when I mention global impact. Transposition is something that is not new. I mean, the British Empire imposed the common law in all the colonies, and now we have countries that follow the common law. The Spanish Empire and the French imposed the civil law in their colonies, and we have countries that follow the civil law. So transposition is not good or bad per se. It's a fact. It's something that happens for many years. So when I say that there is a global impact, that there is transposition, the best examples that I have for you today is what's going on in Latin America. In Latin America, there are many countries that follow the GDPR nowadays when they are changing and reforming their data protection laws. You have the example, the old example of Argentina and Uruguay, but currently you can see what's going on in Chile, what you can see what's going on in Costa Rica. And not only, and I want to highlight on this, not only on the GDPR, but also with Convention 108. I wrote an article some years ago, a couple of years ago, about the Latin American impact of the GDPR and Convention 108. And it's very interesting to see why some countries like Argentina or Uruguay wanted to be state party of Convention 108, because that benefits the country to be considered an adequate country for the EU and within the framework of the GDPR. So this is, again, in Latin America, and I can mention other parts of the world as well, that transposition is working. I mean, so there is a global impact. My second point is that this Brussels effects, as I said, is not only, it doesn't involve only technical issues, but it's also a political process. Why I'm saying that? Here's the story. Argentina was the first country in Latin America that received an adequate decision from the European Commission. That took place in 2003, before the GDPR. it was the time of Directive 95/46. And one day, Argentina was considered an adequate country. If you see carefully the story of that and you read what the Working Party of Article 29 said about that decision, they said, hey, you're crazy. This country cannot be adequate. They don't have an independent data protection authority. Who cares? The Commission adequate Argentina. Why? This was my question all of this year. I mean, you will not find nothing written, obviously, but there was a lot of pressure because at that time, Europe wanted to establish countries in other parts of the world with free flow of data, of personal data. Argentina could be a good example for economic reasons. There were companies that were putting a lot of pressure in Europe to have Argentina adequate. And one day, we became the first Latin American country that was considered that maintain or that have an adequacy decision. Again, the Working Party of Article 29 say no, because we analyze the situation and they don't have an independent authority, data protection authority, which is key for this. Argentina, and they said, I mean, the legal argument, well, Argentina make a statement that they are going to change that situation. Yes, we changed it, 14 years. After 14 years, we changed the situation. And then we have GDPR. Interesting story. So we apply, not to be careful with this. We don't apply. I mean, the GDPR itself said that the countries that already have an adequacy decision have to be, reconsidered and to review according to the GDPR. Okay. This is what the GDPR said. The GDPR said something else, that those countries should be reviewed by May 25, 2020. Okay? No, 2018, sorry, 2018. Or 2020, no, 2020, 2 years, because it started in 2018. Okay, after 2 years, countries like Argentina should have a new adequacy decision. Okay, the Commission start asking Argentina for a lot of explanation. Argentina explained why Argentina comply with the GDPR. They ask a lot of questions about how data protection apply to law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Argentina explained that for many times. Today, Argentina did not receive yet the renewal. Uruguay is in the same situation. What happened in the meantime? Guess why? South Korea received adequacy decision very quickly. Japan received an adequacy decision very quickly. Who was the last one? Or maybe one of the last one? The US. So the US is considered, have an adequacy decision. But what? A sectorial. They don't look at what's going on with intelligence and law enforcement treatment of personal data. So my point is, even though we cut and paste GDPR, which is not exactly what we did, but even if a country cut and paste GDPR, maybe it's not going to have the adequacy decision soon. That's why I'm saying that this is a political process. If you want to be an adequate country, to consider an adequate country, you don't only need people that knows the rules, that can change the rule, that can do the transposition of rule, but diplomacy, playing the game there. And this is one of the recommendations. And my third point, and I'll finish with this, is I mentioned that the global impact consists not on or depends not only in the acceptance of the targeted country, but also in the acceptance of companies. In this point, I I would say something that you mentioned. It's very complicated to think in transposition of rules if you don't have in mind the context. For example, last year I have been working with Internews on a project about the independency of regulators in Latin America and Africa. The situation is not good. It's not good. So let's think for a moment that you put on paper all the standards that are coming from the GDPR and now, for example, from the DSA in a country in which you know that the regulator is not independent at all. That could be a disaster. That could be very bad. That could be the dark Brussels effect, as Jason said this morning. So the recommendation, my experience, is that you have to have in mind before doing this transposition, the context, the country, the culture, I mean, the legal culture of the country, the possibilities to apply this law. Because if not, I think that Usama said in the previous panel, you only will have a checklist. Everybody will be happy. Everybody will say, yes, I mean, you have a law that followed the GDPR, or you have a law that apply the DSA principles. But in the real world, you will not have protection for the individuals, which is something that we really want. So those are my views on this issue, and I deep more on GDPR and Convention 108. I mentioned DSA, but I'm sure that in the near future, if not now, we will start talking about the AI Act and the intention of Brussels to impose regulation of artificial intelligence all around the world in a particular view, which, good or bad, depends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as you were speaking there, it just struck me again about the importance of the rule of law, of course, in this context, and that we need to think about the rule of law in a given country. And in a sense, and I'm not sure that all the companies will agree with me when I say this, but in a sense, on the data transfers case, actually the European Court of Justice has done us a favor with, for example, the litigation on the US transfers, because it's actually given a more objective framework and including provisions about surveillance and law enforcement involvement. So it's obviously an ongoing issue, as we know, but nevertheless, I do think that those rulings are significant in terms of bringing more rule of law. So Lillian, this is actually a very timely introduction for you. We've just talked about European laws creating a precedent, how we have to be aware of the context. Obviously, you are working in Uganda on the civil society side. What's your take on this dark Brussels effect, good Brussels effect? How is it, or how might it play out? And what do you think people need to be aware of from your perspective?
Thank you so much for having me. I feel anything that involves legislation, at times my heart skips a bit, because where I come from, again, I think we talked about this yesterday quite a lot on the effect of bad laws, whether old or new. But just building on what Eduardo has just shared, I think there are good aspects and there are also bad aspects. Giving an experience, let's talk about the GDPR. I think the time it came into force, it gave some sort of, there were some good aspects to it, because we saw some countries from, say, Africa rushing to adopt data protection laws and, in order to comply to that, which was a good thing. But in that being good, also there were also bad aspects to it, because then there are aspects of how much data can we control. And we've seen a whole new muster, of countries pushing for data localization. And whereas this may not be that bad, but from Africa, where data governance, systems and processes are still weak, some are non-existent. We have countries that are at different levels of development. This is a big issue. So when you have policies or legislations coming from the global, EU. Everyone, EU is doing it. Why can't we do it? You're talking about regulating big platforms. How big is a platform is something that, again, we need to think about, because from Africa, most of the platforms, we've had some platforms say we don't get that much, traction from Africa. We may not be able to comply to this, and that has brought in quite a number of, disputes between, the platforms and, other governments. But that aside, I think right now, when I think about the DSA Act, and something that captured my attention is, requiring to assess risks as defined by national laws. I mean, this is just providing more or less a clear path, for majority of the countries, in Africa to kind of, continue doing everything bad they've been doing with legislation. We've had laws that have been already in existence, whether old or new ones, that have come up to, regulate or, protect users online, cybercrime or content regulations, laws, but in the end, they have been used to further curtail, freedom of expression, even users' privacy and the like. So when such, to me, it is really vague. A national law, again, back to what Eduardo said, context is very important. If this kind of, mechanism or whatever criteria is used, if a national law requires mitigating a risk, we have, I don't want to mention countries, but content regulation in Tanzania, there's a particular, regulatory piece that requires for, regulating and, mitigating risks around, economic interests of the country. National security, which is quite broad and vague. So when you bring in a law, what is a risk that is related to economic interest? For instance, how do you define economic risk or rather interest? So this kind of, leaving kind of vague writings or, attributes in laws makes it much more easier for elsewhere where we are still struggling how to get around, implementing laws and, adopting or catching up to what the global, the rest of the world is up to, makes it easier for autocratic, regimes to just, get cut and paste and say, it's happening elsewhere, we might as well do the same. Again, the other thing probably that I wanted to talk about, so again, the issue of law enforcement and, judiciary is kind of, a laughing matter because, again, it works well in good democracies. I don't know what is a good democracy anymore. Even countries that we looked at back then that we thought were that democratic are no longer that democratic. Freedom House can say otherwise, and probably other, ranking democracy kind of, indexes can say. So again, when you look at that, you're giving too much power to, to systems or, to systems that are already, impaired, like, for instance, in law enforcement, from where I come from, can just go and, conduct surveillance, or go and confiscate someone's, gadgets, or just enforce something without necessarily getting, the judicial kind of, there's no judicial oversight to addressing some of these concerns. So I think we need to be very careful, not just adopting something or, enforcing something that region X thinks works and just says the rest of the world should just, fall into that, because then when it comes to, regions or, countries or, systems that are already weak, it just gives them, a golden plate, just to go and join the party and be part of this. So I think those are my key takeaways for now. I'm happy to.
Thank you. And I think it's a really powerful point indeed to be mindful of. And as you were speaking, it struck me as well that we often hear this, that it'll be okay in a good democracy. And honestly, going toe to toe with some EU legislators at the moment, one of the arguments that we have to make is that it is a good democracy because it respects the rule of law, because we don't allow law enforcement to do what they want when they want, and maintaining that. So I think you're absolutely right to say that it's not a given, even in so-called good democracies, and something that we have to maintain around the world, in particular at this. Konstantinos, now that I got you on the panel in the end, prevent you from running away. You obviously for many decades have been following some of these issues at the international level, at global governance level. And it struck me also when Lillian was speaking that there's a lot of risks at national level. You know, to what extent can some of those risks be mitigated by the fact that the internet is global, some of the global governance? You're obviously active at the moment at the Global Digital Compact, the discussions at the UN around the Internet Governance Forum. How do you think that the regulation can impact some of those global processes, or how could those global processes even help mitigate some of the risks that we're talking about today?
Thanks, and hi everyone. So approximately 18 years ago, a very young and frankly naive me was in Tunisia banging on the doors of a UN process, the World Summit on Information Society. That was the second phase that was taking place in 2005. That was about to determine the process that would essentially accompany the internet. The multi-stakeholder model was asserted during that phase. And since 2005, it has been key in the way we discuss, understand, and help evolve the internet. And it is important because, as we all know, and we keep on hearing from many different people, the internet is a very complex system, and solutions cannot come just from one stakeholder group, whether it is a government or businesses or civil society. So back then, we've managed to get in. We had the help with the help of the Swiss government and the United States government and other governments from Europe. And we were all celebrating the fact that suddenly civil society was actually able to get on the microphones and speak, something that right now in this day and age, we sort of consider as a given after 20-something years of doing this. Fast forward to 2023, and the geopolitical scene is very, very different. At an international level, we are seeing a major shift in the way the governance of the internet is being discussed and where it's headed. And you've mentioned the Global Digital Compact, which is the latest attempt to fix the governance of the internet, because apparently the multi-stakeholder model has left many, many gaps. What effectively this GDC wants to do is to take some topical issues, content moderation being one of them, AI, fragmentation, data portability, you name it, and throw it back into the multilateral system and allow governments to come to a consensus or a better coordination, as they say, of how these issues should be tackled. Now, if you were to step in right now into this space and you were to hear this, and especially if you were to read the issues paper that the United Nations Secretary General has issued and the various processes that have been that have followed since the publication of these papers, you would say, oh my God, this is great. The international community really, really wants to get this right. Problem is that the international community is not at a place currently where it can coordinate or even collaborate to get anything right. We've heard from, I think, everyone before me that Europe is currently leading in many ways the global regulatory efforts. And it is a conscious decision that Europe made, right? Approximately 5 years ago at one of the Internet Governance Forums, and for those of you who do not know what the IGF is this annual UN held meeting, multi-stakeholder meeting, where stakeholders gather and they discuss really topical issues. And the impact is that actually they have a forum to address those issues. And hopefully governments will take it and go back. But really, it is everyone can be there, right? Civil society and businesses and governments and so on and so forth. So you would think that this GDC would be able to do that, but what effectively wants to do is retract and chip away this multi-stakeholder model and put it within the UN's multilateral system. And we all know that this is happening behind closed doors. So 5 years ago, at one of those events, President Macron, he was newly elected at the time, stood up and said, we have two systems of thinking about the internet. The one is the US, which is market-driven, and the other one is the Chinese, which is based on regulation and state intervention. I am paraphrasing, and please go and say it because it's online. And he said, I have great sympathy for the Chinese model of regulation. However, we believe that in Europe, because we are a democracy, we can actually do better, and we want to propose a model that sits somewhere in the middle of those two, right? So effectively, he was saying that Europe will proceed to regulation, but because of the values and democratic principles that the union, that underline the union, this model should be able to provide solutions to many of the problems that exist within the two systems. 5 years later, this is highly disputable, as far as I'm concerned. And not in every file. I don't really want to diminish the work that has been done and the effort that Europe has done in data protection, as well in content moderation. I have huge hopes still for the DSA and the DMA. But there are other files, like the encryption file, for instance, where we are actually seeing Europe, distracting itself from these democratic values and trying to impose a system that will create irreparable harm in many ways to the open, global, and interoperable internet. And this is something that I feel, in national legislation, people don't have, regulators and policymakers do not have the tendency to think a lot. What is the impact on the internet? Because, of course, you are a sovereign state and you need to regulate. But at the same time, you claim that you are in favor of an open and global and interoperable internet, and that doesn't happen by accident, right? The networks, we have thousands of approximately 70,000 autonomous systems. These are huge networks that interoperate, and they need to interoperate every day in order to move data from point A to point B. And that is based on specific protocols and standards that are coming out of multi-stakeholder bodies like the Internet Engineering Task Force or the Internet Corporation for Assigning Numbers, and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing is that those processes are not taken into account, right? Another example in Europe, the DNS4EU, is a very, very good example as to how Europe is not really considering the global naming and addressing system, and how, creating a European DNS resolver in order to be able and actually address the enforcement issues in content moderation will affect that global naming and addressing system. And the problem is that, well, I see two problems with that. First of all, it is the fact that internationally, Europe is losing increasingly its credibility to stand up and defend the open, global, and interoperable internet. And as I have said somewhere, it will take an experienced diplomat from China or Russia to actually call them out, call Europe out. And the second one is the fact that the internet is fragmenting, right? And unfortunately, the internet is fragmenting from within. And what I mean by that, it is from those democracies that have supported consistently and historically its open and global character. So right now, we're at a stage where things are changing fast in the way decisions will be made for and about the internet. And as we're moving into a more state-centric approach, we are seeing that there is a fragmentation even within the way democracies understand and want to defend the internet, something, of course, which plays excellently in countries like China, that they want to legitimize their own model, and they have managed to do so by exporting it, not in its entirety, but elements of it through things like the Belt and Road Initiative. And I believe you will know more living in Africa, where a lot of the African countries are adopting Chinese regulations. They're taking tools that China is using in order to, surveil its citizens or undermine this idea of the global internet. And at the same time, and this will be my last point, because you're allowing much more governmental intervention, you're also undermining those technical standards and protocols and the processes that lead to them. And again, the most recent example is the new IP, right? Which was a proposal by Huawei, supported by China within the International Telecommunications Union, that really wanted to displace. It wasn't about replacing, which I think is brilliant. It was about displacing the current IP system, right? And create a centralized protocol that effectively would allow the state to control how packets of data would move from point A to point B. And with that happy note, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I was also thinking, as you're speaking, can you send me the link to Macron's speech? Because at the moment we're in the thick of negotiations on the EU AI Act, and I think some of our friends on the European side might want to be reminded about where that middle ground is, as opposed to China on things like facial recognition. So that's really, so thank you very much. Because we're running slightly late, we have time just for one question. Do we have one person who has a burning question to ask us in the room? Any questions that we have? I don't think so. So maybe that will allow us to keep things on time. Well, thank you all so much. What a broad and interesting discussion. Really enjoyed talking to you all. Thank you so much for your time.
We're going to move to a fireside chat. For that, I'd like to invite the Vice Chair of GNI's Independent Board, Agustina Del Campo, and joining her would be Menno Cox, who is the Head of Sector for the Global Services, global aspects of digital services at DG Connect from the Commission. So we're very keen to hear the Commission perspective. So over to you both. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for staying with us through the last bit before our reception. I think we had a lot of questions opening during the last two panels, and we have the great pleasure of having someone who has firsthand knowledge on some of those questions that we heard during the day. So thank you for joining us first.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. Well, one of the overflying sort of questions is, what is happening? There's a lot happening with the DSA implementation. The DSA is in full force, and you're coming out of the summer holidays, which was an interesting, quiet period in DSA implementation. But now we're back in track, and I think there's a lot happening. So would you share with us a couple of the key things that you identify as moving forward the implementation of the DSA, which is this massive
thing.
Yeah, growing every day, I'd say. It's also my excuse for not having joined you for the rest of the sessions. It's really, really busy, and that's a good thing. So just by way of background, I work on a team that deals with the international aspects of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which are inherent to these two acts that regulate cross-border services. But what I tend to say what is key to catering to those international aspects is to try to get it right in terms of enforcement at home. And this is why I also work on the enforcement of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act with that same team here in Brussels. And I think that's also a good reminder that the Digital Services Act is a piece of internal market or international regulation, which is key for the access to information across borders also within the EU. That's your first really important international aspect of the Digital Services Act. And beyond that, much more obviously so, there are many, many, many layers of transparency mandated now under the DSA, which also lead to a certain standardization of reporting that have direct impacts for the rest of the world, as would similar legislations in other jurisdictions have impacts here, and I guess for the global resilience of our societies and knowledge of what is going on. So if I identify quickly in terms of what's going on in this massive and growing machine that is now the enforcement done by the European Commission of the DSA, I would put the various items in roughly two buckets. Firstly, it's about operationalizing the Digital Services Act in terms of procedures and maximizing its potential. And the second is playing the role of the regulator. But I'll get back to the second because it's really important to understand what I mean when I say acting as the regulator, because it is a very nuanced role that you have. But if we turn to the first bucket, operationalizing the DSA, I'll just give a couple of examples. Of course, we need to make sure all the required delegated regulation is in place. And you will have seen that just a few days ago, the Delegated Act on Independent Audits was adopted. And this is a key piece. In order for the annual audit cycle to kick off, we need to have this in place. If you have read it, I wouldn't blame you if you haven't, but you will have seen that it tries to make good on the promise of the Digital Services Act. It sets a very high standard for the required quality and rigor of these audits. It talks about the need to do risk assessments on the audits. It talks about the required sampling and the quality of the samples taken. It requires a constant evaluation of whether the auditor is able to deliver on its mission. So it's really all about making sure this is a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. And this is a very crucial piece. With this, the process can kick off, and it's of course up to the service providers to now make this happen in practice. We expect a very serious effort from the get-go. We don't expect, of course, 100% effectiveness in terms of mitigation measures from the get-go, because this is a cycle and we will have to improve over time through informing our society so that we can together actually have a discussion about these mitigation measures. That brings me also to another example. The DSA, as I mentioned, delivers a lot in terms of transparency for the public. And you will have seen that the Statement of Reasons database went live, I would say roughly a month ago now. And as at this afternoon, it was at 235 million statements of reasons. So these are content moderation decisions that have been taken by platforms regarding content that reached EU users. It's done in a privacy-preserving way to, again, stay in line with the architecture of the Digital Services Act, which is to be a systemic regulation. It's not about trying to identify in a specific case, which is more for dispute settlement done by the platform and external bodies, whether something went wrong or right, but to see the trends. Are there spikes in certain problematic content? Is there problematic content on platforms where it wasn't expected, where the mitigation measures are maybe not effective? Really, for everyone to look at these trends and then perhaps in specific follow-up to use the identifiers and ask what was going on here. I think this is a great example of a piece of transparency that delivers for the rest of the world, because this database is hosted by the Commission and it's not geofenced. So researchers around the world, to my understanding, are already trying to understand for which research questions this is actually a key tool. And of course, it's one of many tools. We also have the ad repositories that are now being put in place by the various platforms. We again need to see whether they meet the requirements of the DSA. But again, a very important piece of transparency that can together give us the required holistic understanding of what's going on online. Many more pieces of implementing regulation, like on the supervisory fee that platforms need to pay, that you may have seen. And this week, also one of the obligations started to apply, which is to deliver a transparency report. And various platforms have today published those, which also contain interesting information, which can relay to the Statement of Reasons database. Again, it's getting very technical very soon, but I'm sure you all are very familiar with this. But it's quite nice to see it starting to work in practice. So maximizing the potential of the DSA is one bucket that we're focusing on. And there's very many developments that build on the initial designations of the 19 services in Europe. The second bucket is making sure that the EU plays its role as the regulator. And I said that's a nuanced role, because if you enforce a systemic instrument that is built around the risk assessment, bolted on with several very targeted obligations, then as a regulator, you need to make sure that from early on, you ensure that the tools are being put in place by the service providers so that our societies can use those tools. But it's not for the regulator to investigate each and every case and take enforcement action, precisely because that would be given the signal that the regulator is overstating its role. I think this is the balance that was struck, that no actor online should play an outsized role in content moderation. It's really a process whereby all the actors' human rights are constantly balanced, where every actor needs to be empowered to play its role. So there is a very important role for the regulator to play, but it is also a role that is inherently limited. Part of that role is to gather evidence, and you have seen that 3 formal requests for information went out to 3 service providers, TikTok, Meta, and X, of course. That's what happens, right? You forget the obvious one. This is also not prejudging investigations, a formal opening of proceedings or anything under the DSA, but a very important part of making sure the supervisor can play its role as the supervisor that needs to make this whole instrument work. There we will, you will have seen there are different deadlines depending on the urgency, and this is a very important signal that enforcement is an absolute priority. This is done by the team that I'm a part of, which is also growing. So it's impressive to see that the EU is making good on its promise to make sure the capacity is in place. But that also brings me then maybe to the second part of the second bucket, which is that the regulator is part of a very, very large field that is occupied by different stakeholders. And an important part that the Commission, European Commission as central regulator plays, is to function as a network of networks. And what we're trying to build out is this networking capacity where we first of all, of course, work already with national digital services coordinators. And last week, the Commission even adopted a recommendation for member states to speed up the process of putting these in place, these authorities, because they're already needed today, to work together in an informal network to make sure that we can respond to the ongoing crises. The DSCs are an important part, but the word coordinator had baked into it that they need to coordinate a very large multitude of expertise at national level. So the competent authorities, but also the stakeholders in all the different areas covered by the categories of illegal content online and the societal risks need to now be networked so that they can be activated quickly. And this is an enormous challenge, I think, but one of the key priorities for the Commission. So you will have also seen, and I'll stop there, but that's a final example of recent action, is that earlier this week we signed agreements as the European Commission with specific authorities, the Irish DSC, the Media Authority, and Arcom in France, to make sure we can cooperate very effectively. So it's an administrative arrangement on enforcement matters, also for the larger platforms and vice versa. So it's really going beyond to make sure we have that networking capacity.
Great. Well, thank you. I think you've touched upon some of the most pressing questions that a lot of people had, not only in this room, but also during the IGF a couple of weeks ago. They were wondering what was happening with the local authorities, what was happening with the delegated acts, what was happening with the requests for information. That was a big question. So thanks for addressing that. One of the things that came up during both of the panels this afternoon was compliance and the benchmarks for compliance. It was mentioned during the first panel that under the current system, companies are identifying within their audits their benchmarks, sort of. And one of the things that Owen, our colleague from Ofcom, mentioned in the last panel was how Ofcom is preparing guidelines for when the online harms bill come into effect, what Ofcom will expect from companies to consider them in compliance with the online harms bill. So I guess a big question personally, and I think for this room, based on where the conversations were going before, is how is the Commission thinking about conceptualizing compliance? Because I understand from what you were saying that you will not be looking at the individual content, you will be looking at processes within companies and strategies, teams, and ways in which due diligence and risk assessment is managed. But how are you thinking about what will be enough? How will sufficient due diligence be evaluated? What are you expecting from companies as they go through this first iteration?
You already gave a very good answer for me, actually, as part of your question. But no, I'm kidding. It is part of the answer that, of course, making sure the companies comply with the letter of the law to a degree that they feel entirely comfortable is not our primary goal. It is an internal assessment. And I think that is very important because, as I said, we need to make sure the Digital Services Act now delivers for our citizens. And for that, you want to set a high bar. But it is very difficult to determine before we have all been able to judge all of the information necessary to make informed decisions about the adequacy of mitigation measures, which are very much in the hands of the online platforms themselves. And where for the moment we were reliant on voluntary disclosures and on whistleblower activity to judge beforehand what is sufficient. So with that framing of needing to ensure that the companies know how to comply is maybe not a very accurate representation of what the situation is. We know there are certain societal risks, and we're not asking online platforms to provide the ultimate solution to those risks. Of course, some of those risks emanate in society, in the offline world, are amplified by the information. In the end, this information is a vector for the societal risks identified. Online platforms can be a very crucial piece of the puzzle in terms of evidence and also in terms of allowing us to study these societal risks. And over, I think this I will reiterate, over the risk cycle, which will be here to stay for the foreseeable future, we will have to collectively make sure these risks are effectively managed. But if you think of strict compliance, we need to see serious efforts in terms of risk assessments and risk mitigation strategies, of course, and in terms of compliance with the more direct obligations that are meant to empower our citizens, like putting in place a dispute settlement mechanism, making sure you transparently report on the actions you already take. All of this is pretty straightforward, and there we expect strict compliance. We're not. It's better to frame that outside the compliance in terms of effective solutions.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you, and maybe there's no answer yet to this question, but under GNI standards, for example, under the GNI principles, we have improvement over time as the standard that we look at to find companies compliant with the GNI principles or non-compliant. Under NetzDG, you have a number of quantitative measures that it's time limits, content taken down within a certain period of time. It's aggregated numbers of content taken down that can show the seriousness sort of the measures adopted. Can you hint as to where the European Commission is where are you guys thinking of taking the compliance towards? And I'm thinking about I'm concretely thinking about Thierry Breton's letters a couple of weeks ago that were demanding for a concrete time frame to take content down and concrete measures, which is take content down. Can you hint as to where or how the Commission is thinking about this serious efforts to mitigate risks?
Yeah, I think it's a very tricky question because what I said, one of the first priorities is to build the necessary evidence base so that you can do benchmarking. In the end, of course, you want to understand what the risks are, and the platforms are a key player in identifying those risks, subject to independent audits that confirm those risks. And then you need evidence on how serious and what those risks are and what the impact of those risks is, and what then proportionate mitigation measures are. And this needs to be a conversation that you have as part of a regulated industry that has now come into being. So it is almost impossible, and it wouldn't be prudent to say this is expected in terms of the absolute benchmark for compliance. Obviously, that is a logical assumption that improvement over time is a requirement for compliance. That is actually hinting at what that underlies is that you assume there's no perfect compliance at the outset. But that's why I'm trying to say, let's maybe separate the word compliance from the effectiveness of the risk assessment process, because there's compliance with the DSA, which puts in place this process, and then there is effective mitigation measures. And I would separate the two for the moment. And for the latter, we are really building our network, and also with, for instance, the Center for Algorithmic Transparency in Seville, also a global network of experts, to make sure we can have this informed debate and constantly check what is the state of the art. And personally, I was quite reassured that the outcome of the negotiations on the Digital Services Act were that there aren't concrete benchmarks or specific technologies identified and imposed on online platforms, which would be in a way setting a benchmark for compliance.
Thank you. Personally, I am super interested in how the DSA turns out. I think it's a worldwide experiment. I think this interest was shared in the two panels that preceded this conversation. I think there are two different kinds of interests. One, because we know that the DSA, the legislation in Europe, has an impact elsewhere. It has an impact on company conduct a lot of times. Whether it has an impact on regulation elsewhere, it's a different matter, but it does have an impact. And two, because I think, as I'm part of the academic constituency at GNI, but I also identify myself as an advocate for freedom of expression. I think
there are serious concerns as to how to protect human rights in the digital environment, that the DSA provides one potential solution or one approach that is being tried out, sort of. So as an experiment, I think we're all really interested in seeing this played out. And I dare say there's a lot of interest in seeing it succeed. So I guess my next question is, you've spoken about a regulatory dialogue, a conversation, and it's the same language that was posed sort of with the data access to research and how that research would feed into the implementation and whatnot. So for those of us in the rest of the world who are not Europeans, how do you see that engagement happening? How can that conversation move forward?
It's essential. I think it is happening already. Of course, for building the global evidence base, we're building on work over many decades that has been ongoing, and that needs to continue. And we really want to build, outside the legal framework, also the relevant networks. I mean, I should say that at the outset. And then as regards the powers granted in a way, or the tools made available under the Digital Services Act, and I already said at the beginning, Europe would also stand to benefit from similar tools in other jurisdictions if it can be constructed within a framework that respects fundamental rights. And the previous panel mentioned rightly that this is very often difficult to achieve, and not by giving a right regulatory example necessarily. But within the instrument, of course, you mentioned Article 40 on data access for researchers. The research done under that article on systemic risks in the EU will be inherently public. That's, of course, one of the requirements of the article. So there is already a very important interest in speaking in the academic community about what are the key research questions that this article should help answer. How can we help also, even if in the end it is, I mean, this is still the implementing, or the delegated acts can come only after the DSCs are appointed. It's a bit of a technicality, so after February 2024. But that is going to, of course, then deal with the issues of who exactly benefits from this provision, which was intended to have a wide scope, of course. But regardless of who benefits in the end, the academic community is global and can already work on also how to make sure there are secure ways that are up to the standard of the regulated entities to have access to data, to make sure that the research questions are coordinated and well documented and argued, because these are all of the legal requirements in the article that need to be overcome for these first requests to be honed. And then, of course, there is also a part where we will be working with digital services coordinators on preparing the infrastructure to handle requests from academia. That's a very concrete example where inherently there will be a global aspect to this academic research that will be done. Whether or not directly by researchers based outside the EU will have to be seen. But it is a very important article, and one of many. I already mentioned the database that is not geofenced. The reporting now has to cover, on content moderation, has to cover any visibility decision. So platforms are no longer able to determine what is in and outside of the scope of what they consider content moderation decisions. You see that it is working. The reporting is done live and it's very fast. And we already saw a spike recently. And everyone can see this and verify and ask questions. But it goes much beyond that. As the transparency reports are out today, trusted flaggers will need to publish reports on their work as one of the stakeholders that are also addressed by the regulation. The risk assessment reports will have to be made public in due time. The audit reports have to be made public. The list goes on, and that's, I think, where we all stand to benefit. Then I also wanted to maybe recall that the DSA indeed kind of operationalizes this digital right for EU citizens, which I try to formulate as making sure citizens have agency over online content moderation, which is happening inherently. And if you, I mean, it's up for debate, but that should be a universal principle, right? And so we're not indeed saying that it should be exactly the DSA that should be copied everywhere, or that's not even our objective, but it's more that we all are working for that universal principle. And I think EU researchers would be very keen on this being these similar transparency tools being put in place in different jurisdictions across the world, so that we are collectively more resilient, as we are already global user bases on these very large online platforms across the world.
Thank you. So I'll ask one final question, and then I'll see if there are any concrete questions, because we need to wrap up by 5:45. Yeah, okay. So besides academics and civil society and probably states that do have an interest in participating in a lot of these ongoing conversations, a lot of what is happening with the DSA is that a lot of the terms of the DSA will serve as terms of reference, whether to be adopted or rejected, but they are going to be the terms of reference for key things like, what does systemic risk mean? Another stakeholder that has a key interest in this are companies, and not only European or European companies, but also companies outside of the EU. So I'm wondering how the DSA seeks to build on and take account of efforts that companies have been making to identify and mitigate risks under the UN guiding principles, efforts like the GNI principles, for example.
Yeah, I would say immediately that these are extremely important efforts that will continue because, as I mentioned, these are global companies and they have activities in so many jurisdictions where they will need to continue to do these human rights impact assessments and more, and hopefully can also start reporting quicker and more comprehensively than perhaps they have been doing so far. And in a way, we now depend, as I mentioned, on all of the stakeholders to have this discussion and set the bar high, but also in reasonably high, of course. But platforms have had the experience firsthand over the past decades in moderating content online and have inherently already set certain standards. We are here to make sure, as a regulator, that their power and their activities and the fact that they remain free, also with respect for their freedom to conduct a business, to design their policies and to propose mitigation measures. The regulator has been put in the middle to make sure there's no abuse of this, in effect, standard setting capacity, and to maybe undo some of the things that were not conducive to effective results in the past. So it's really going to be a space to watch, as you are already doing. I think everything is there to make this very successful. And it will be, I think, coming back to the fact that these are services all operating in their unique circumstances that will need to be judged by their stakeholders and their users, first and foremost. And an informed regulator can then make sure that the right actions are taken without having to arbitrarily impose or invent new measures that may be completely unproven. And I think I come back to what I find, or what reassured me when this law was finalized, that there is no preference given to any technology, and that platforms in that sense get to play their role that they play now, but more sustainably so.
Well, are there any pressing questions? Yes, we have two.
Okay. Thanks. It's a very specific question that follows on from one that Agostina asked, which is about benchmarks for compliance, but specifically around Article 34 and the systemic risk assessments. And I was struck by the contrast between the UK's approach, which requires Ofcom to produce guidance on how to undertake a risk assessment before the company does it, whereas the Commission decided not to provide any guidance to companies, even though some of the terms, things like civic discourse, public safety, negative effects on well-being, weren't defined in the law. I'm just wondering why the Commission made that decision, because it seems to me to place quite a significant burden on a company to demonstrate compliance without any methodology or guidance of what they need to do, and then be audited on it later, of course.
Thank you. I was just wondering, like, how the European Commission plans to track all this. Like, you have like a lot of I guess projects after the summer break. I know that there are DSCs that are keeping track of this nationally, but just like from a global perspective in Europe, what's the plan? So for example, Ofcom mentioned that they're trying to do like a one-to-one guidance with big companies. Is that something that the European Commission is going to do as well? Like have like a one-to-one conversation with these companies to keep track of all these different projects? And then lastly, like Annette had mentioned in her own chat that like competition drives companies. And I was wondering, like, do you think the European Commission could like maybe create like a top 10 companies who are doing great implementing a DSA just to like keep people on their toes? That could be fun. Just a suggestion.
So that idea I already note down, and I call for more. Thank you very much. Then regarding the summer break, for many colleagues, there was none, but that goes to my answer to one of to the two questions, which is that the work to prepare the implementation of the Digital Services Act have been ongoing with the relevant providers for a long time. And there are, of course, intense regulatory dialogues with each of them to make sure that they deliver, understand well overall what their obligations are, and to also make sure we can understand their own concerns, difficulties, and constraints. But overall, the approach is indeed not at the outset, at the kickoff of the first cycle, risk assessment cycle, to give guidance where for an informed debate, and in order to set the bar high, we need to first see what the risk assessment reports deliver, and at the same time build this evidence base from the moment the law started to apply, which is the moment from which it can also take effect. It would, in our view, be an approach with many downsides to start as a regulator to think you have all the answers and be able to set exhaustive guidance where companies would always also want more, because in the end, companies have an interest to reduce risks, especially for litigation or compliance risks to the minimum. So that's a different approach that's specifically taken. No summer break.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us and for responding to our questions, which a lot of times can be really hard questions. But I guess they are coming from a good place, which is a cautiously optimistic look upon the implementation of the DSA, and a hopeful one. So I think on behalf of GNI, just we want to see this successfully work. So thank you so much for joining us and for continuing to dialogue with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Menno and Agostina. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for sticking with us. It's been a long, intense, but I think really rich 2.5 hours. Thank you to those who've stayed with us online as well. This is the last of our public events for this trip to Brussels, but no doubt we'll be back and we'll continue to work with our friends and partners here to continue these kinds of discussions based on sort of the rich expertise across the stakeholder ecosystem. We do really want to see these regulatory efforts succeed. We really believe a lot of value that can be generated out of this approach, but it isn't going to be easy. It's going to be really, really complicated. And so the more of us that can be involved and engaged, the better. And so for GNI's part, we are there for it. We are hoping to continue to encourage more of that. So let me just ask everyone to kind of give a big round of applause to everyone who spoke today, but also to all of the GNI staff for all of their incredible work in putting this together. And as a reward, we have a reception for you out front. So please grab a drink, socialize.